On would be a good start. Good morning, everybody, and can I welcome members, officers, and the public here in the meeting room or watching on the webcast to today's meeting of the Budget and Performance Committee. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched off or to silent mode to avoid any unnecessary interruptions this morning. Can I start by asking our clerk, Paul Goodchild, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. No apologies for absence, but Assembly members Clark, Harani and Dr Sahota are joining remotely.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare?
Noted.
Thank you. Can we note the ongoing actions arising from previous budget and performance committees?
Noted.
Thank you. Can we move on now to our main item of business, which is a discussion on the 2022-23 GLA budget, group budgets for Transport for London. And I would like to welcome our guests this morning, Andy Byford, the Commissioner for TfL, Simon Kilonback, Chief Financial Officer for TfL, Patrick Doig, Group Finance Director at TfL, and Enver, Assistant Director, Group Finance and Performance for the GLA, and he's joining us remotely. Good morning all. As is normal, as the chair, will start with the questioning. And the first question, if I may, please, to Andy Byford. Andy, at the Budget and Performance Committee on the 5th of January, the Mayor set out TfL's financial position and the latest on the funding and financing agreement from government. So do you have any further updates for the committee?
Well, good morning, first of all, Chair, and Happy New Year, everyone, somewhat belated. Obviously, I've seen what the Mayor said. I think the Mayor gave a very comprehensive answer, but let me just bring the committee absolutely up to date with where we are. As I think committee members are aware, we currently have a fairly short-term deal, which takes us through to the 4th of February. That was a deal that we struck with government just before Christmas. Again, as I always say, very grateful for the financial support that we've received, but obviously the fact that that was a short-term deal means that we once again will be going back into negotiations imminently. In fact, we've already had some opening discussions with government. So where we currently are is where we previously briefed you. We are at the moment, unfortunately, having to assume that we will have to enter into the worst of our three scenarios, namely that of managed decline, with all that that implies, because right now we do not have a clear commitment or a clear understanding of what monies we will have to be able to budget around. But we are working on that. We have put together some additional information for government, as was their request, as was a condition of that funding deal, which expires on the 4th of February. Government said that they wanted the Mayor to be more specific around new income sources. The Mayor has already committed to increase council tax and is considering changes to fare structures and ticketing, but has been also asked to identify further revenue sources such that we can close the gap on revenue and hopefully get to a position where we don't have to enter that doomsday scenario of managed decline. So that's largely where we are. What obviously I really want to do is hopefully in the next round secure what everyone I think around this table would know we need, which is a long-term deal for TfL that's fair to the taxpayer, but it also enables me to plan with certainty and to critically have the capital that we know we need, capital support and the operating support only for a finite period, but capital for a longer period in order to help government meet its very own objectives. So, Chair, that's a high-level summary of where we are.
Okay, thank you. I mean, you anticipate that ridership will return to 82% of the pre-pandemic passenger volumes from 22-23. What is that assumption based on, assuming the government's top-up arrangements continue? How critical are ridership levels to your 22-23 budget?
Well, I mean, ridership levels are obviously critical to our budget because TfL uniquely is so dependent on fares through the fare box. We previously briefed you, it's to the tune of 72% of our income comes through the fare box. Contrast that with my previous stomping ground, New York City Transit, 38%, which is much more the norm. So the difficulty that we have, yes, we've got that figure, but right now, particularly with Plan B, with the Omicron variant, it is very difficult to plan with certainty because there are a lot of variables. And if I just talk about Plan B, which obviously, as we all know, included a return recommendation, strong strong guidance to return to working from home. On the first day, we saw an 18% drop on tube ridership and 6% on the buses. And bear in mind that every 1% equates to around £50 million of annualised budget. So this is a very movable feast. But in terms of modelling, we've modelled around 4 demand variables: the pace of economic recovery. For that, we draw on information from our GLA colleagues in terms of economics. Office worker return profile, which we have seen dropping off. It was picking up, but it's dropped off again with that more recent advice. Office work trips and winter suppression. In other words, the effect to which, in addition to the Omicron variant, the effects of winter further increase the amounts of infection and thereby suppress the return to work. So it's something that we're modelling very closely, but we are hugely dependent on ridership because that's the bulk of our source of income.
Okay, I mean, this 82% figure, though, doesn't include the Elizabeth line or Crossrail, does it?
I'll ask my CFO to talk through the detail, please.
So I'm sorry, things are falling off the table. What we're saying is that the revenue will return and demand returns to 82% of the 2019 levels. And in our 2019 business plan, we had forecast ahead for the new services that would be coming on stream. So the comparison is to the 2019 levels. But later on, I think we can explain a little bit more about the comparison between the 2019 business plan and the 2022 budget. So yes, it's not comparing to that uptick that we get from the new services of the Northern Line extension that was opened this year or the Elizabeth line, because they obviously weren't open in 2019. But some of the other comparables that we talk to government about need to be looked at compared to what we forecast 22-23 revenues to be in 2019 and what they will actually be now as a result of COVID and other things.
So just to clarify, the 82% doesn't include new ridership from the Elizabeth line or Crossrail?
So it does include some ridership on the Elizabeth line because we had some services running in 2019 on the Great Western and the routes down to Heathrow. And for 2022-2023, we have always forecast that there would be some services opening. So we'll set it all out for you, Chair, because it's a bit complicated to talk. So it's easier to set something up for you in writing so you can see some tables and things.
I'm slightly baffled because slide 17 of the PowerPoint that you gave in TfL's December board meeting suggests that you're not including any of those figures. So clarity would be helpful for all of us, I'm sure, however complicated it may be.
We'll provide that, Chair.
Thank you. Given that, then, what is the driver for that? Because you've put an estimated figure of 269 million of income from the Elizabeth line in the budget. So, in other words, why are you not including it in the passenger volume calculations when you do include it in your income assumptions?
As I said, Chair, we are running services even before the Central Tunnel section opens on the eastern and western main line. But as I said, we'll write to you setting it all out very clearly. We tried to set it out clearly in the budget presentation, and we'll make sure we write to you with a clearer answer so you have what you need.
Yes, please, because it does look as if you've included it in the income, but not included it in the numbers. So we like to be able to compare it.
Yeah. So the demand profile, as we set out in our budget presentation, excluded the Elizabeth line, which is really the Central Tunnel section element of the Elizabeth line, because it wasn't open in 2019. It will be open in 2022, and therefore our 2022-2023 revenue assumptions will reflect on top of what we're giving you a like-for-like comparison in that slide, but then in the income slide, we are obviously including what we expect and forecast the Central Tunnel section income to be when it does open. So that's the difference between the two. A like-for-like comparison against 2019 demand, and then a forecast for the 22-23 year that includes the expectation that the Elizabeth line will be open.
Okay, if you could set that out, it would give us more clarity going forward, I think. So, Andy, what degree of confidence do you have in the budget as we've seen it? What degree of confidence have you around numbers returning, etc.?
Sure. I think as much confidence as I can have, but bearing in mind the hugely volatile situation in which we find ourselves, not unique to TfL, obviously, but there are so many variables. Obviously, we need to get the Elizabeth line open. I'm sure that will come up later in questions. But I'll say straight up, I can confirm that the opening window of the first half of 2022 stands. That has not slipped. But the variables being what level of support are we going to get from government? And critically, because there's a linkage, what will the prevailing situation be in terms of rider confidence and rider return, passenger numbers picking up again, progressive population or not of central London offices, and a number of other variables. But we're good. We've got good people. We base our predictions on modelling. We base our budget on economic information, which is derived from various sources. So I'm as confident as I can be in a very uncertain situation.
Okay, yes, I do understand there are so many variables in this, and I think all of my colleagues do understand that. Simon, in the Mayor's consultation budget, expected passenger income has increased by 177 million for the period 22-23 to 24-25, compared with the draft TfL budget submission. Can you explain the assumptions behind the increase?
Yes, there are. When the Mayor wrote to government as part of the current funding deal, he set out some additional measures that we would take some assumptions of additional measures that we are considering, and we've therefore baked into the budget that will be finalised when the Mayor makes the fares decision in the upcoming period. So the planning assumption remains RPI +1, and this incremental income is from looking at some changes to the structure of fares over and above the RPI +1. They're part of the discussion with government at the moment, and they are subject to the Mayor making a mayoral decision on the fares and fares structure in the coming weeks. So we'll be able to set that out more clearly when we get to the finalised budget position.
Okay, well, we'll look forward to seeing that. Simon, when have you assumed that the central section of the Elizabeth line will open?
So I'll let Andy in a minute give you an update on the actual opening of the railway itself. But as you know, we've said publicly that the central tunnel section will open in the first half of 2022. Therefore, from a prudent budgeting perspective, we've assumed that the income starts to generate from the end of that period, and it is linked to, because we have these railway period months, it's linked to a railway period that begins on the 26th of June. So that's not obviously our intent to open it at the end of June. We've said it will be within that first half of the year, but from a prudent budgeting perspective, we've assumed the 26th of June as the opening date.
Are you hopeful?
Yeah, would you like me to elaborate on that at this point, or would you rather?
No, we're all ears when it comes to this. We're wondering if it will ever happen, Commissioner.
Absolutely, it will, Chair. Along with the budget and TfL finances, the Elizabeth line continues to be my #1 priority. In fact, literally every day I have a call on it. I have my usual check-in call this morning at 0800, which enables me to challenge the team and make sure that we're on track as best we can be. So we're making good progress. We entered trial operations on the 20th of November, which was the exact date that we targeted, and that itself followed trial running being where you test systems, trial operations being where you test operational scenarios. And all that is happening in parallel with finishing the 2 remaining stations. There's only 2 remaining to be finished. One is Canary Wharf, one is Bond Street. Canary Wharf, I anticipate, will be handed over to us in order for us to take full possession within a matter of weeks. Maximum. It's very, very close to be handed over. Bond Street, which when I inherited this project, and remember I asked to take carriage of this, I kind of insisted on taking control of this. Bond Street, when we took it over as TfL, was 18 months behind, 18 months behind schedule. We're now probably around 3 months behind schedule. So it's still later than the other stations because of the complexities which we inherited, but we've got back to a radically improved position, and we brought someone in specially to focus on that. So what remains to be done? The trial operations program is about 40% complete. We've still got a number of operational scenarios to do, including the critical mass evacuation exercises, where you use around 2,000 volunteers to literally test operational scenarios. Are you ready? And then once trial ops finishes, I want to have a spell of what I would call ghost running, some call it shadow running, where with no trial operations and no trial running, and with the railway in its final configuration, in other words, no more work being done, no more software drops being done, everything ready exactly as it will be on opening day, you just run up and down relentlessly to make sure you get the reliability right. So obviously the elephant in the room, the question is, how long will that be? It'll be as long as it takes. In that, obviously we all want to get it open. I can very confidently say first half of 2022. It has not slipped on my watch. It won't slip on my watch. It will be the first half of 2022. But no one, yourselves, Londoners, will thank me if it's unreliable. We all saw Heathrow Terminal 5. We're not going to rush it, but we will obsess about getting the reliability right. And I will give the go once I'm certain that we can open flawlessly. And that will come once we finish trial ops and I can see everything working as it should do, then I'll give the go.
Thank you. Well, at least I have confidence that you are watching it closely. Would that somebody had done this prior to you, but I'm glad at least you're doing that, so thank you. In 2020, the Mayor agreed further funding of 825 million for Crossrail. So will that be enough to complete the project?
Well, we're certainly trying to achieve that, Chair. Bear in mind, though, that the two public commitments I've made, which I'm happy to reiterate here today, was number one, there'll be no slippage to schedule, further slippage to schedule on my watch. There won't be, and there hasn't been. And number two, that we won't have any further recourse to public funds over and above that which we inherited from the outgoing Crossrail board. And bear in mind, what the outgoing Crossrail board said was that an additional 1.1 billion would be required, of which we've only secured 825 million. So what I've said to my team, in addition to setting them the challenge of the earliest possible safe and reliable opening of the central section as challenge one within the first half of 2022, and the second challenge of an expedited pseudo through running by the autumn of 2022 to give passengers further benefit. The third challenge I've set is to get as close as damn it to the 825 million. Now, right now, we're exceeding that. We're over and above that, but we are rapidly shedding cost. We are demobilizing tier one contractors who are very expensive, and we've had a lot of success in that manner. We've got a real tight grip on scope, project scope. We are already transitioning team members, Crossrail team members, into normal business. And I'm confident that we will not, we certainly won't need the full 1.1 billion. I'm trying as best we can to get as close to the 825 million as possible. We have reduced the run rate per month, the actual cost per month. And my forecast right now is we won't be far off the 825 million. The fact that we're exceeding it at the moment still can be offset by the amount of risk we're carrying. As we retire risk, that gap will close. So I'll keep you posted.
Well, that's good news. At the 5th of January 2021 Budget and Performance Committee, David Bellamy referred to a figure of 150 million, which we believed was to be put in addition to the original 825. So you're saying hopefully that won't be needed?
Well, that's the pressure. So for transparency, that is the current pressure. David was correct. But there's still time to offset some of that increase by more aggressive retirement of risk. and progressively curtailing prolongment of the project. The longer it goes, the more it costs. It stands to reason.
Yeah.
So I would hope still to be able to close that gap, or at the very least, not see that gap grow anymore. Because the reason I've directed my team to get close to the 825, never conceding we won't need the 1.1, so that's my public commitment, is because I do not yet know, I have no certainty of whether funds will be forthcoming to meet that gap. So I've had to assume that we've got to do it for 825.
Well, you've anticipated my next question, because I was going to say, if you do need more money, and Mr. Bellamy mentioned the 150 million, but part of that, where would that money come from?
We would need to talk to DFT about that. The GLA budget is maxed out in terms of the loan arrangement that was previously secured to get that to that 825 million. We would need to talk to DFT about that. The DFT are aware of that. My peer is the principal secretary, the permanent secretary, sorry, at the Department for Transport. She knows that that is a conversation we would need to have were we, in spite of our best efforts, unable to constrain the additional amount to the 825.
Okay. Can I just ask you, what level of passenger income have you assumed for each year from 22-23 to 24-25 from the Elizabeth line? Simon, is that likely to be you or Patrick?
Yeah, just bear with me a second, Chair.
Yeah,
I'll
no,
just
sure,
try
thank
and
you.
find my notes, and I'll then let you know. Chair, I'm afraid I don't have it readily to hand specifically for the Elizabeth line, but as we're writing to you anyway, I can set that out.
Would you
as
put
fast
that
as
in the
I
letter?
can. Absolutely.
Be most grateful. Okay, I've seen Assembly Member Duval.
Chair, I'm not sure whether I should ask it in this section, so I seek your guidance before I pose the question. It's about current funding models and about the bus ridership issue. Should I leave that for the next section, or would you prefer to ask it now under this? It follows on from your question on section B.
You may as well ask it now.
Okay, fine. So on the look, if I understand it right, and thinking long term about TfL funding, the current funding model, which TfL relies on the fares, is now broken. It's gone. So in terms of, is it the next set of negotiations, or what work have you been doing on what would be its replacement? Or do you think that's always going to be there? We're going to go back to the issue of the bus ridership model contributing to that. Is it the plan? What's the plan around the longer term issues around that? And I know it's mixed up with negotiations, but really, what are the alternatives around that funding regime if we can't get the ridership back up to pre-pandemic levels?
So, Assembly Member, thank you for the question. I'll start at high level. I'll ask my colleagues to add to what I say. Well, first point to make is Londoners and London relies hugely on buses, particularly in certain parts of the city. We've got a very big bus fleet, 9,500 buses, and I've previously described the bus. People think it's the tube, but the bus is the workhorse of the London transport system. So that's point number one. Point number two is a lot of people on low incomes absolutely rely on the bus. They don't have cars, they maybe don't have access to the tube, so we're very committed to running a high-intensity bus service. But your point about the funding model, my professional opinion is what this pandemic has exposed is an almost reckless over-reliance on fares through the fare box, 72%. We've got to find a different model. We've got to find a different mix whereby we get closer to what would be the international norm, which might be 50% funding through the fare box and 50% found through other means. Now, those other means can be direct subsidy, which of course used to be the case at Transport for London and before it London Transport years ago, and/or different revenue models so you bring in more revenue, which is why we are working with the Mayor to look at different revenue streams, be those wider road user charging schemes. Obviously, the Mayor's preference is for London to be able to retain vehicle excise duty, as is the case across the rest of the country, but not London. So we need to find more revenue sources to offset the over-dependence on fares. That would be my high-level summary, and I'll ask Simon to add to that, please.
Thank you, Andy. Assemblymember Duval, you may recall in January last year we set out and published our financial sustainability plan. That had 3 scenarios for the future of London's transport system. The one we call the policy consistent is based around delivering on the shared objectives of government and the mayoralty of decarbonising public transport, supporting a green industrial revolution and creating jobs and growth around the country. That's our preferred scenario, where we have both financial and environmental sustainability for the long term wrapped up together. That needed about £2 billion per annum of incremental funding, which was the same amount of funding that the independent review saw as the necessary level of funding for transport in London. We then had a more financially constrained scenario where we still did all of the things that were consistent with getting to net zero carbon in transport and becoming financially sustainable, but over a slightly longer period, which therefore didn't have all of the investment we would need to get to those targets by 2030, and that needed about £1.5 billion of incremental investment. And then finally, we had the situation where we're currently facing, where we need to reduce services and investment because of the unavailability of both revenue and capital funding, which creates the managed decline scenario. As part of that plan, and as part of the independent panel review, we looked at a number of options in terms of how the funding structure of TfL could be changed to be, first of all, more consistent with our cousins on the National Rail and National Highways network, who have long-term funding with dedicated hypothecated funding streams. We made the case in that financial sustainability plan, again, as has been talked about, as you know, for many years, over greater devolution of tax receipts to London and greater levers for the Mayor to be able to use to be able to fund London himself or herself in the future. But throughout the rounds of funding negotiations we've had with government, the prospect of structural reform and the prospect of devolution of further funding has been ruled out, and we and the Mayor have been told to concentrate on the income levers that the Mayor has, which are fares, council tax, and then schemes that are primarily for managing congestion or emissions on roads, that are not in law allowed to be set up to be revenue generating schemes. They have to be designed to deliver a policy outcome. They may have the side benefit of generating some revenue, but you can't design them to be a revenue generating scheme.
Assemblymember Pigeon.
Just on Crossrail, I wanted to pick up with you. You've given the 26th of June railway period as your assumption for the central section. What is the railway period assumption for joining up the east and west? I think the Commissioner said you're looking at autumn to try and do it, and that is when you get the big financial benefits rather than people transferring from one line to another. You get new income coming in. So when is that railway period assumption, please?
Just while Simon looks, let me just say what happens. So there's 2 more stages after the central section, basically 2 more stages in September. And this is an innovation where we were going to wait till the December and May timetables on the main line respectively, because obviously you can't just run our trains through the middle and have them turn up whenever they feel like it at the portals. They've got to fit in with the main line timetable. We've come up with a way of, hopefully in September of 22, but it really is led by when we open the central section, September of 22, we're aiming to have trains from the east come through, and where currently they terminate at Liverpool Street, they'll be able to go through to Paddington. And conversely, on the west, from Heathrow and Reading, where currently they have to terminate at Paddington, they'll be able to go through to Abbey Wood. So that gives about 90% of the customer benefit. So it does get the revenue stream started. What that then leaves is to finish the job off so that you can have trains going all the way from Shenfield through to Heathrow and Reading, and that would be done in a combination of those two timetable changes, December and May. So that's the plan, and I will ask Simon to comment on the financial implications.
Thank you, Andy. And Chair, if I may, I've now located the actual figures you asked for, which I'll weave into this response for the
Lovely,
annual
thank you.
increase. So, as Andy said, and as you'll recall, the Central Tunnel section is in our control to open, but the elements that connect with the National Railway Network have to open in the May or December windows that the National Rail timetabling takes place, other than the element that Andy's just talked about. So, from that perspective, we have assumed that stage 4 would open in December 2022, in line with the railway period starting date, and then stages 5 would be in May 2023. And so, as a result of that, our current projections, which are impacted both by COVID and by that latest modelling around our expectations of return to work, show that the 2022-2023 Elizabeth line income would be 262 million compared to a 489 million forecasted in the 2019 business plan. The 2023-2024 income would be 516 million compared to a forecast of 884 million in the 2019 business plan, and that the 24-25 income would be 610 million compared to a 1.037 billion pound forecast in the 2019 business plan. So significantly impacted by COVID, and in particular the expectations for return to the office, in particular in the central business districts.
And just to clarify then, your assumptions are December and May, but if it all goes well, you might be able to start generating some income from September, additional income that may help boost the budget for a few months.
I would say, I think, as is prudent in any budget, you budget around certainties as best you can identify them. So a certainty is the timetable changes, because they are set in stone. You know that those are the only opportunities you've got to implement those two fairly radical expansions to Crossrail. But what we're trying to do is do that earlier combined phase, because that is within our gift. But I think for budget purposes, it's entirely prudent. I support my CFO in assuming the timetable changes for the purposes of budget. But I take your point that there's a potential upside if we do succeed in achieving that hybrid in September.
Thank you. Assembly Member Fortune.
Thank you very much, Chair. Could I start very quickly, if you'll indulge me, just by saying thank you to Andy and the team for the work they did over Christmas. I had some correspondence, and I know everyone was working really hard to try and secure some deals. Everybody's trying to get the best for Londoners. I just wanted to have a quick investigation, a quick chat about the long-term funding conversations we've had. I've got a copy of the Secretary of State's letter here from June, and he talks there that because of COVID, because of the challenges to the system, etc., that it's still not ready to make long-term commitments until we get an idea of how it can all stabilise. And it's that long-term commitment, that stabilisation, that I just want to look at, because we talked about international comparisons and the difference between the ticket box versus the costs and where you find that balance. And you will know this, of course, because of your time at New York and other, where I learnt they called you Train Daddy. Is that right? You're good. So when we look at those comparisons, are we comparing like with like? So if you look at things like relative number of staff, pension costs, all those other costs, how do the two systems compare? Not just the ticket box, the rest of it.
That's a great question. Thank you, and I appreciate the reference to Train Daddy. Brings back happy memories. So there are a lot of similarities. Let me just sort of headline them for you. In that like the Tube, the New York subway is very old. It's slightly newer, 1904, if I remember rightly, whereas ours is 1863. But it's a very heavily capital-intensive operation. It's got a big bus operation over there, a big paratrans operation, a bit like our dial-a-ride. The organisation itself is bigger for direct costs because New York City Transit, of which I was the president, has 50,000 employees. It's huge, whereas TfL has around 27,000. But then, of course, bear in mind the model's different here because our bus operation is, and most of our rail operations, heavy rail, are above ground, are contracted out. So that's a difference, albeit offset by the cost of those contracts. The funding model has some similarity in that there is a mix in terms of fare box and other incomes, where the real change is that we're here, as I said earlier in my earlier response to the chair, where here we rely to the tune of 72% of monies through the fare box. New York relies on, this is just New York City Transit, not the other railroads, but New York City Transit relies to the tune of 38% money through the fare box, the delta being made up of a fairly hefty direct subsidy from the state, contributions from tolls applied on bridges and tunnels, and a number of other less important funding streams. But the headline is that although New York has suffered terribly from COVID and has itself had to have multiple bailouts, including one I saw just yesterday, 16 billion, if I remember rightly, from the feds. I mean, they've certainly had some good contributions from national government. They too have really suffered through a collapse of ridership and therefore an impact upon fares through the fare box.
Thank you. And I only have a dilettantic knowledge of this, but so what you're saying is with things like toll charges, road user costs, things like that, there's a greater element of taxation on the public that's topping up that fare box, whereas we don't have that.
Yes,
here.
And where London Transport back in the day, TfL, did have a direct subsidy from government, that no longer exists. In New York, there is a direct subsidy from Albany, the state capital, which subsidizes the MTA, the overarching body akin to TfL, including New York City Transit. The bridge and tunnel tolls are levied by the MTA via a separate agency, but New York City Transit is the primary beneficiary of that tolling funding.
So there's increased cost to the user, which can offset that difference from the state subsidy.
Yes, it certainly is a different model, and I would argue it's less, it clearly is less dependent on the volatilities of ridership because you do have other income sources, primarily that state subsidy from Albany. But even the bridges and tunnels toll revenue, that itself is volatile because if fewer people, as is the case, are coming across the East River, bad example, across the Hudson into Manhattan, then that income is affected as well. So the most reliable funding it typically is state subsidy or subsidy that is less volatile and less vulnerable to the vagaries of demand.
So somewhere like New York would have had a double whammy in that it would have seen the fare revenue drop off, but it also would have seen the taxation, the vehicle, the road usage money drop off as well.
To a certain extent, although just as here, my understanding is that just as here, road travel, car usage, has to a certain extent replaced mass transit usage, which obviously is what you want to avoid. I mean, we've talked here in London about avoiding at all costs a car-led recovery. Otherwise, you do get into a downward spiral because suddenly your roads are gridlocked with all the disbenefit to the economy and the environment that brings. But also, those people who are using and still loyal to public transport and sat on the bus are stuck in a massive traffic jam. So what do? They go, I'm not having this, I'm going to get in my car. And it gets even worse. Yeah. So that's what you need to avoid. There is some of that going on in New York.
I get that. And I know you can't look at these things in silo. There's always nuance. But I was just trying to make it clear in my mind that if we had increased road user charging with people being at home and not being out on the road, you would still have that drop off. So there's an element of being back in the same place. Do the transport networks in other big metropolitan areas have the same reach into local authorities in the way that we do with things like funding, lip funding and stuff like that?
Well, I'll draw on another one of my previous roles, which was the Chief Executive Officer of the Toronto Transit Commission. That is wholly owned by the City of Toronto, not the province of Ontario. So the province provides a bit of capital support, but the TTC is subsidised by the City of Toronto, and so therefore it's a more dynamic mix between direct subsidy and fares through the fare box. And it's run by the political entity of the City of Toronto. My boss at the TTC, I was the CEO, was a politician. It was an elected chair who was himself a serving city councillor.
Thank you. Can we go to Assemblymember Russell now, please?
Thank you, Chair. And I'm just going to slightly reorder the questions because two of them run together properly. But I'm going to start with a question for Andy, which is that I spoke with the Mayor last week in Budget Committee about managed decline and the way that safety is safeguarded for public transport, but not for our roads. And sort of TfL is terming in the budget papers Vision Zero as an enhancement. So what that looks like from the outside is that Vision Zero is being slightly lost or downgraded as a goal, although Vision Zero is absolutely critical safety work. So can you explain this difference in approach between safeguarding safety as something that's absolutely critical on public transport, but allowing Vision Zero to be in the category of enhancement and therefore much more at risk in terms of the amount of budget that's spent on it?
Thank you for the question. I'm not trying to turn this into my resume, my CV, but another former job of mine was as safety director. I was operations and safety director for Southeastern Trains. So the only reason I make that point is that being a safety director, A, you don't take that lightly. It kind of lives with you, the onerous responsibilities that title implies. But B, also, you do understand the correlation between risk and investment, and also the need to always put safety first. So I'll just say that as an opening comment. I'd argue, actually, it may be not the way it comes across in the budget presentation. I would actually argue that we are adopting a consistent approach to both public transport and roads, in that job one is to maintain the safety of the existing system first with the money that you've got before you look to do enhancements to roads or to road junctions, for example, or on public transport before you look to build new extensions or add any other embellishment. So safety has to be put first, to the extent that if you were not able to guarantee the safety of an asset, let's say, for example, the Rotherhithe Tunnel. If we literally didn't have enough money to be certain that we could run that thing safely with the ventilation and the other fire safety suppression systems that requires, because it's going under the river in a confined space, then one option, somewhat nuclear, is that if necessary, you would shut it rather than put people at risk. Now, obviously, we don't want to go there. So I think the Mayor was talking about, in his response, was that we must maintain the safety of the existing assets, be they public transport or roads, before we look to do any enhancements. Now, back to my point about being a safety director, one of the key things about being a safety professional is you've got to be proactive, not reactive. There'll always be an element of reactive. If something happens that you couldn't have foreseen, you're going to learn the lessons, you're going to do something about them. But you should be aiming to be proactive, which is why I really strongly urge everyone, including the help that hopefully you'll be able to give me, let's not go to managed decline, because if we do go to managed decline, then to a certain extent you are being reactive. You can only really budget to maintain the assets you've got, where I want to be more proactive. We know that there are Vision Zero initiatives that need to be done on junctions that need to be improved, and that's why I need more than a managed decline budget. Simon?
Thanks, Andy. And just to follow on from Andy, so there's a couple of things, Assemblymember Russell. First of all, as Andy said, we do treat the assets consistently. We have licence conditions from the safety regulators for the operation of these assets, and that's why we have to prioritise the safety of the existing asset base first, and then only if we have enough money to do so can we invest in improvements to the asset base. Unfortunately, many of the Vision Zero improvements are that, they are improvements. And under the current funding assumptions that we have to work with, we have no money at all for any improvements on any of the asset classes. The other bit I just wanted to make very clear is this: we didn't come up with this methodology on our own. This is a prioritisation methodology that was agreed with the Department for Transport as part of what they were prepared to help fund through this period. So again, very, I'm sure if we were to have any incremental money that meant we were able to avoid managed decline, we'd all be wanting to look at doing things to improve Vision Zero and accessibility first, rather than in the past where TfL's focus is about being growing capacity as well as doing those things. Clearly, given our current demand projections, we would focus first on improvements to safety and accessibility, were further funds to be forthcoming.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about places like Holborn, places like Battersea Bridge, where we've seen high-profile deaths of cyclists and people walking. Having the improvement of those known dangerous junctions where there are repeat collisions which kill and seriously injure Londoners, it's very worrying to hear those talked about as being enhancements to the asset base, because this is about, we want Londoners to be feeling confident to walk and cycle their journeys and use and use those modes to get to public transport rather than jumping into their cars. So I just think that there's a class of locations where there are known risks to people who are using those assets to walk and cycle along, where it seems worrying that those are being deemed as enhancements rather than absolutely fundamental maintaining the safety of the system.
Assembly Member, I share your passion and I share your concern. And I say that, particularly you made reference to Battersea Bridge. I went to Battersea Bridge after that tragic accident that happened a year ago yesterday, actually. I went down there and I wanted to see the site for myself, and we have actually made improvements there. We've put in traffic lights to provide safe crossing for pedestrians and also to provide better security and safety for cyclists and for other road users for that matter. So I do understand that there are other areas, and believe me, this is not a scenario that I like one bit, same as you, because again, back to the safety director part of me, if you have guilty knowledge of something, you should act upon it, and you should also exercise due diligence. In other words, that you should do everything possible to eliminate risk. However, the stark reality is if you do not have enough money to do everything, then it is about choices and it is about prioritizations. So therefore, we are absolutely focused on job one is to make sure the existing arrangements are as safe as they can be, but absolutely looking always to improve where there is a clear safety risk. Simon?
Thanks, Andy. And just, we made all of these points when we were trying to negotiate additional capital funding in the spending review. We got zero additional capital funding in the spending review, and that is the reason why we don't have the money to do the things other than the core. We haven't even got enough money really because we've set out the managed decline scenario. That's well below what we really want and need to be doing on the core public transport network as well. So we've made all of these arguments, but this is where we are as a result of a lack of long-term funding and adequate funding for the transport network.
Have you thought about other options like sort of blanket speed reductions? You've done that on the Westway to reduce the speed and therefore to reduce the wear on that flyover. Have you thought about that as a way of reducing the risk on to people walking and cycling on your network more widely across the city?
Yes, Assembly Member, we adopt a range of measures. I mean, in some cases, they are traffic calming measures. We look at speed, we look at traffic lights and other means of controlling risk. For those locations, such as you mentioned, Holborn, we will look at all options. Obviously, we have to do that bearing in mind what the impact will be of implementing those further restrictions and those further traffic calming measures. You've got to be careful always in fixing one issue. You don't inadvertently cause a secondary safety concern or problem somewhere else. So sometimes these things do take time because you can act in haste and get it wrong. But my view is you leave no stone unturned in trying to reduce risk to the lowest practicable level. But again, invariably, it comes back to money. Not that many measures require zero funding, but we will keep looking at all of these critical sites.
It could be a helpful thing because
Sure.
obviously if people are travelling at lower speeds, that also reduces the wear and therefore the maintenance costs for the road. So in
Yes,
terms of
indeed.
reducing future maintenance costs, you could cover your policy objective through something that might actually also help to save money.
It will, and Assembly Member, you'll be aware that we have introduced quite a few speed restrictions in London to provide the benefits that you just so eloquently described.
Thank you. I'll move on, which is actually moving back towards something that Assembly Member Duval raised. So the congestion zone charge consultation document estimated that proposed changes would raise a net operating surplus of around 60 to 80 million pounds a year. Has the same assumption been used for this budget, and what is the operating surplus prior to the change? And that's a question for Simon.
Well, Chair, Assembly Member Russell, if I may, I'll ask Patrick Doig to take that one, as his previous role was as Finance Director for Surface Transport and is very familiar with these things.
Good morning. So we have assumed the changes that are now being approved by the Mayor are implemented in the budget, and the underlying assumptions on those changes are consistent in the GLA submission with the previous consultation. But we would appreciate these are increments, as you say, to the base level of traffic volumes that are in London. And therefore, as that base level of traffic volumes has changed throughout the pandemic, the exact amount these temporary changes, now permanent, would raise in any one given year does change. But the same underlying assumptions that we consulted on and the Mayor made a decision on have been incorporated into the GLA budget submission.
Thank you. And what is the expected impact of the changes on the volume of car journeys?
So in terms of the changes that we've implemented, we modelled them in terms of car kilometres rather than journeys per se, but clearly there's a close correlation between car kilometres and...
I'm very happy to have an answer based on car kilometres.
So a £15 charge level, which is one of the changes, is expected to reduce car kilometres by around 4% in the weekday periods compared to the previous charge level.
To increase car kilometres?
Reduce car kilometres by around 4%. And the extension of the hours to 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock on Saturdays and Sundays is expected to reduce car kilometres by around 15% compared to a situation where no changes were made to the pre-pandemic scheme. So there's a larger reduction on weekend, given that's comparing to no congestion charging being present on weekends prior to the temporary changes introduced as part of the pandemic. So it's 4% for the £15 level and 15% for the introduction on weekend afternoons.
What about the evening? You're opening up the evenings again, so because I thought that was extra.
So I've described the traffic impact of the measures that we retained and will become permanent as part of the mayoral decision. I don't have the figures for the elements of the temporary changes that haven't been retained, but I can...
Could those be sent through to us, please? Thank you. Thank you very much. So then my next question is also, I think, to Simon, but maybe get redirected. The greater compliance of the expanded Ules does mean that income generation from this scheme will be lower than expected. Now, I know you described at the beginning that congestion, these projects they must be designed to deliver a policy outcome rather than to generate income. But it is also when the budgeting is going on, we do need to understand the income generation impacts of the policies. So what is the current level of compliance with the Ules? And what has been assumed for the 2022-23 budget in terms of compliance?
So I'll start, and again, I'll ask Patrick to pick up on some specifics if I miss it. So as you said, it is really important to understand that these schemes are designed to be a success in either improving compliance or reducing emissions or reducing congestion. We don't have the powers to design a scheme that is, the design feature is to maximise income. So it's really important.
Don't worry, I'm delighted if compliance is good, because but we do need to understand what the impact of that is on the budget.
What I'm trying to explain is, and I'll get to the point that you want, which is the specific figure, but because of that, the way in which we budget for the revenue that comes from these schemes is you have to forecast what you think the compliance rate with the policy outcome is, and then what the contravention rate is for people not paying the charge if they're not compliant. So these are quite big variables. A lot of work was done based upon the original Ules zone, and we based our forecasts and budgets upon the levels of compliance and the levels of contravention that we had been experiencing in actuality from that zone. So we had originally budgeted that we had expected a level of compliance of about 87% in terms of the vehicles being compliant with the ultra-low emission zone extension requirements. We are currently at about 92% of compliance, which is obviously significantly higher. It's actually where we thought we'd be a couple of years from now. And as a result of that, the budgeted income will be nearly between £200 and £300 million lower than we had originally budgeted for this year, and about £600 million lower over the course of the next few years, which is the one time as finance directors you'll hear us sort of pleased that the policy is working and the income is lower. But otherwise, obviously, it does create that pressure again on our finances as a result of much higher compliance, leading to much lower levels of charges and penalty notices. Patrick, was there anything further to add on that?
Not on the budget assumptions, no.
So, what are the behaviours that you're seeing that you didn't anticipate? Is it that just more people have cleaned up their vehicles more quickly? I mean, there's certainly been a huge amount of communication about the purpose of the Ules, so maybe people...
Yes, so that's the main driver, that many more people had already switched to cars that were lower emitting cars than we had estimated when we were putting the scheme together.
And have you seen the owners of polluting vehicles reducing their usage? Are you able to even measure that?
Well, let us take away and have a look at what data we've got on that. That's not one that I readily know about, but we'll see what we've got, and we'll provide you with whatever we've got on that subject.
So it's certainly true there are fewer vehicles in the expanding zone than we had expected. So as well as compliance being higher, there are fewer overall vehicles. Therefore, as Simon said, we can't prove it directly, but our strong hypothesis is a combination of both factors. People changing to their cleaner vehicles, but also those that haven't yet converted their vehicles, leaving them at home and not making those trips.
Yep. So the policy is actually having a productive effect. So in terms of the budget proposals, you're looking at basically 200 to 300 million less or 600 million less over the longer term?
That's right. And of course, with the benefit of a few more months of experience, as we come to finalise the budget for the March TfL board, we'll reflect into that final budget process and more of what we've learned over the last few months since the ultra-low emission zone extension was implemented.
And given that the Ules, which was designed partly to clean up the air, but also to get those congestion benefits of reducing traffic, given that the vehicle cleanup is happening faster than you'd expected, are you looking at all at per mile schemes that might overcome that the problem that, or the good problem that so many of the vehicles have been cleaned up?
Well, as I think you know, Assembly Member, one of the elements of the MTS is to look at those per mile and distance-based schemes for the future. That's not the technology upon which the current schemes are based. So we are currently looking at the what do we do? Having successfully introduced both Ules and the expanded Ules, we are looking at, well, what do we do next? But clearly, there's a lot of work on the policy side to do first to determine what follows on from the expanded ultra-low emission zone.
Thank you. Okay, so the point that you made earlier in the meeting about it, you can't have a policy objective to raise money, but you could have a policy objective to reduce congestion as well as cleaning up the air through cleaner vehicles, which could that statement earlier in the meeting was not a statement saying that you're not going to look at per mile road charging.
So I think we'll look at all delivery mechanisms that would allow us to get to the policy outcomes of net zero transport, net zero emitting transport, and by improving I mean reducing congestion and fostering the switch to 80% of all journeys being walked, cycled, or taken by mass public transit. So that we are looking at all those things. We don't have anything at the moment that that is a firm scheme that we're going to take forward. We're looking at how we deliver on the policies and beginning to think about how we enter into the various discussions with stakeholders about the best way to continue the trajectory we are on with the introduction of the ultra-low emission zone expansion.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We're going to have to pick up pace, colleagues, please. Assembly Member Fortune, you had a quick interaction.
Thank you, Chair. Very, very quickly, because it's on that point. Everybody wants cleaner air, and I get the direction of that policy. But one thing I'd really value your commitment on is when you've got some more data, it's where are those fines falling? Who's being impacted? I know my colleague, Assembly Member Garrett, has spoken with some charities that have been impacted by the expanding Ules zone. If we're seeing, regular fines from certain people, that may be because they don't know about it or because they don't have the financial capacity to exchange their vehicle, especially now the scrappage schemes have stopped. I'm thinking that, for example, banks, if somebody's consistently overdrawn, they'll write to them and say, hey, look, we've noticed this is happening. How can we help? So once we've got more data on where those fines are landing and who's being impacted, can we have a commitment to look at it and see how we can help to help those, those lower paid Londoners, charities, etc.?
Sure, I'll take that away, Assembly Member. I mean, we do try to be reasonable. We do say to people on the first instance, typically, each circumstance is different, but we do try to adopt a certain level of discretion first time, but we'll do that analysis and come back to you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Lovely. I want to just pick up a few areas of questions. One is the funding agreement letter. All the correspondence in the past has been published, but we haven't seen it yet for this latest extension. When are we expecting that to be published?
Well, we're being very careful to not prejudice the ongoing discussion in any way with premature release of any document. So we do understand that clearly you've got a right to see things and that you want to see things. But I guess my two criteria, my two filters are: one, I've got to make sure that City Hall are comfortable that when we release things, but also I don't want to release something and prejudice the discussions because they're so delicate. But as soon as we can furnish you with the documents that you want to see, that will be my commitment.
Okay, we understand that this agreement extension letter includes amendments to the current settlement relating to fares and also Hammersmith Bridge ferry. Can you perhaps explain what these changes are?
Yes, while the Commissioner's thinking about this, so, and Patrick might also want to jump in. So, as you will now know, that the national government have announced that they are not intending to increase fares by RPI +1, which is our planning assumption. They are intending to increase fares by RPI only. Therefore, because the condition of previous letters was that the Mayor should increase fares by RPI +1, there is some ability to have that discussion with government about what happens given they've only increased fares by RPI. That has an impact on our revenue because about 30 to 40% of our income is determined by national fares, so that would need to be compensated for in the forthcoming financial year, and then the Mayor will have to take those various things into account when he makes his decision on fares later. So it's around that national decision compared to the condition of increasing fares by RPI +1 for TfL as a whole. And then the Hammersmith ferry option, it was previously a condition for TfL to implement the Hammersmith ferry. And given we're now in a position where the bridge is open to people to at least walk and cycle, that we no longer need to be rushing to implement the ferry option. So again, it's a relaxation of previous conditions.
And if I might jump in there, Assembly Member, the government have said in instructing us to no longer proceed with the ferry, the termination costs will be met from within the funding that government will provide related to Hammersmith Bridge.
So they're going to cover all those costs, because
So
I think it's 400,000 or so has been spent so far on this ferry that has been cancelled effectively.
No, that's my understanding. And I'd certainly expect that to be the case, because if you're asked to look at something and you do so and thereby incur cost, and then the requester removes the obligation to do that, my argument, fairly, you could call it kind of, I wouldn't say simplistically, but it just seems only fair that they should then carry the cost that was abortive.
Yeah, and that's very clear, so I understand that. That's helpful. Just to go back on the fares, you said 20 to 30% of your fares come from national. Is that through the travel card scheme? And is that why that's under review?
It's not just the travel card scheme. There's a whole extremely complicated, very complex table of fares, thousands and thousands of fares. I'm sure Shashi Verma would love to give you a teach-in on the complexities of the national and local
I have
fares
had quite
network.
a few discussions.
Remember, be careful what you wish for.
Yes, I know. I have had discussions in the past.
So it impacts on any number of fares.
Okay, so it's not just travel
It's
card.
more the case that the Mayor was obliged to increase fares by RPI +1. The government have chosen not to increase fares by that level. So it says that as a minimum, the fare must align with the national fares increase. And that beyond the 22-23 year, the impact of not continuing with all TfL fares raising by RPI +1 must be for the Mayor and TfL to resolve.
Just this section's looking at the assumptions in your budget. I've got a couple of things that perhaps maybe Patrick or you could just look at whilst I move on to the other questions. What's your assumption around borough contributions for the Freedom Pass? Is that still based on usage, which will be lower, or is it based on a fixed amount per borough? And also, what is your assumption, given you've just had, it was revealed this week about the number of trips walking, cycling and public transport is at 58.3% compared to 63.2%. Is that going to affect your assumptions around not only that income from passengers, but also impact of greater costs for repairs on the roads. So
So I'll start with the Freedom Pass. So nothing has changed in terms of how the Freedom Pass funding is determined, and therefore for the coming financial year, as you may recall, the Freedom Pass cost is the average of the previous 2 years' demand. So there will be an impact in 22-23
so it's going to go down, isn't it? Yeah.
as a result of the reduced demand as a result of COVID. So
that's another impact coming then.
Yeah, it's another fairly significant impact of reduced funding for the Freedom Pass, but hopefully relating to the actual demand for that particular product. And then I'm sorry, could you repeat the second question?
The assumption given it came out this week that the number of trips walking, cycling and public transport is 58.3% rather than 63.2% before the pandemic. That's just come out this week. Are you therefore looking at revising your assumptions around not only the income onto public transport we've talked about, but also in terms of maintenance, greater costs for those safety repairs on roads and use of the bridges and tunnels and so on? You can always come back if you need to.
Well, the largest driver of maintenance costs is the state of asset condition, and that determines the level of maintenance required to maintain that asset, particularly from a safety perspective. And as our level of asset renewals, particularly on the highways, has been constrained now for around 2 to 3 years, that is increasing the level of maintenance required.
But I think the assumptions, I'm thinking of your planning, Patrick, though, the assumptions, given this has come out, are you going to be making some shifts there?
The level of actual usage, particularly from walking, cycling or private cars, has a relatively limited impact on the asset condition. It's the larger vehicles, HGVs in particular, that has a bigger impact on the asset condition, which then leads to maintenance. So I don't believe that change that we've announced would have an impact on our future maintenance demands.
Oh, that's helpful. Thank you. Can I ask, the TfL GLA Mayor's budget submission shows a balanced position for both revenue and capital. But slide 25 of your presentation to the 8th of December TfL board shows an overall deficit of around 400 million each year. Can you explain to us what's the difference here, which is correct?
So I'll start and then I'll get Patrick to explain to you the difference between the two formats, because before I do, so the way in which we present to the board is done to try and make it easier for everybody to understand what is the total amount of funding required to deliver TfL services and investment, whereas the GLA budget format follows a format in which you have to be able to understand the balance sheet and reserves as well as the subjective tables to really work out what the position is. So at the time at which we sat down with the TfL board, we set out that we were reducing the expenditure of the organisation as much as we possibly could, using the maximum service reduction scenarios that we had discussed with the government in the summer. And also, not only had we adopted the managed decline capital scenario, but we'd actually gone beneath that. We'd had to, for financial reasons, constrain ourselves to the order of about 300 to 400 million pounds of capital that was even reduced further beneath that managed decline scenario, and that still left a funding gap of 500 million. So
500 million.
It was roundly 500 million. If I'm talking on, I know you've got a specific figure there, Caroline, but if I talk about on average over a 3-year period, rather than precise figures, so roundly 500 million, which then became part of the funding negotiation. And by the time that the GLA budget document was firmed up, we'd had through the funding negotiations, a commitment from the Mayor to look at contributing towards that through the council tax increases and through thinking about the fares position. And that left a sort of a balancing item of funding that we need to work through with the Mayor and government in the forthcoming funding negotiations. So, but we are therefore assuming that that will be resolved, and that roundly 500 million will be funded, which is why the GLA budget has a balanced budget position, and the TfL budget at the time, we couldn't assume it because we didn't have a commitment either from government or the mayor to how that would be funded at that point in time.
Okay.
Was there anything else we needed to add, Patrick?
No, that's correct. So what you're observing is that we're preparing these budget and papers whilst having live negotiations with both the government and the mayor, and you kind of see that progression through that period.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. And then finally from me, what is the anticipated financial impact of industrial action on the underground for 22-23, and has this been reflected in the draft budget?
I'll ask Simon to comment on the specific budgetary implication, but obviously we don't want industrial action. It's happening. I mean, let's take the night tube as an example. And of course, it's kind of topical because today's Friday and we're going to have more disruption tonight. We are trying to resolve this through talks at ACAS, and I would just implore our colleagues from the RMT to engage with us and go to ACAS with a meaningful, tangible solution to this that takes account of our funding position. But bear in mind that this dispute is around rosters that have been agreed with the primary or the dominant union, namely ASLEF. It relates to asking drivers to work 4 nights a year. They can swap out of that, so they don't have to work any. No jobs are lost. So it's disappointing that this industrial action is happening. Obviously, it has an impact, but I'll ask Simon maybe to comment on that.
So we don't, as a matter of course, budget for industrial action. So we don't make a provision for industrial action in our budgets. And clearly, when industrial action does happen, the financial impact depends on a lot of variables again. So, is it a network-wide industrial action, or is it more limited? Are we able to run some services or not? So broadly speaking, the financial impact is the revenue foregone as a result of the passenger trips lost. It's clearly almost impossible to predict that until you know whether or not you're facing something. As we get towards the March budget, given the mandate that the RMT have, we might, for the first time in a long time, think about whether we have to provide for a potential impact of that.
So it's not the odd day, is it? I mean, this is sustained, so that's why I was asking it.
I mean, to be fair to the RMT, the ASLEF and other unions either have or are looking at having a mandate for wider disruption or action, namely a strike or short of a strike. And I do understand there's a lot of uncertainty out there. To be fair to my colleagues of frontline workers, unionised members, there is a lot of uncertainty out there. But my plea has been that although I understand feelings are running high, and although I do understand that we need to tackle these uncertainties, and we're battling to try to get this budget issue sorted out, which is really the root cause of a lot of the uncertainty, the worst thing that we could do is incur industrial action, which would only mean that we have even fewer people riding the system. And as we heard earlier, they are the dominant source of our revenue. So that I'm really trying to get across to people that I get that their feelings are running high, but industrial action right now is the last thing that we need.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it is the last thing that we need. Can you tell me just very briefly, how many tube drivers do TfL employ? Approximately.
Can we just confirm it properly to you? I don't really want to take a punt at it. If you'd asked me about New York, I could have told you specifically, but we'll come back to you on the exact number.
Okay.
It's thousands.
Yes,
I don't want to just speculate on the
was.
actual amount.
Can you tell me the average wage of a tube driver?
It's something like 60,000 from memory. But again, we'll confirm
Plus
that in
overtime.
writing to you.
Yes, and with the average, including the overtime, that would be very interesting for us. Thank you.
I'd like to confirm that in writing to you.
Yes,
because
that's fine.
Particularly where that's compared against, say, train operating company, train operators, you've got to be making sure that you are comparing like for like the actual the actual salary. Some TOCs pay overtime, some don't. We don't have an agreement in some grades.
Yes, and some have lots of perks and some don't. I get that, I understand. Now, colleagues, we're really running behind because it is so interesting. We're now moving on to financial sustainability, and I'll hand over to Assemblymember Duval.
Thank you very much, Chair. In the to-in and fro-in between yourselves and government, Um, uh, where do you agree with government concerns, and where do you disagree with government concerns, as set out in the Secretary of State's letter to you of the 1st of June? Right, and at the same time, Andy, if you could just tell us, well, what the reason why I'm asking this question is, what is your response to that letter, and does this, in terms of whether your response or in terms of the government stance, what's the impact on your plans for financial sustainability? It seems that it's connected, isn't it? If we go beyond. Sure. The different, not just this year's budget, but the following year's budgets, on your estimate, we're tied together. Government and TfL seem to be tied together. There is no going back to whatever the good old days or the bad old days, whatever your view is on the financial model.
Well, again, as I've previously done, I'll start with a high-level response, if I may, Assembly Member, and I'll ask my colleagues to contribute. I think where there is concurrence is that a solution needs to be found. No one's saying that we're going to let London's transport system grind to a halt. To me, that's a complete non-starter. That should be off the table. You can't have a capital city which is crippled by its transport system falling apart, or worse, coming to a complete stop. So I think there's concurrence there, that everyone gets that a solution needs to be found. The area of difference, the primary area of difference, is how we close that gap. So we've been given a target. We've signed up to a target that we will. We believe there is a way. We set it out in our financial sustainability plan. There is a way to get back to financial self-sustainability by 23-24, the beginning of that year, on operating expenditure, that being defined by the cost of operations, maintenance, and the cost of capital. That won't be easy. There's a huge savings program that needs to be delivered, but we believe that we can do that. We signed up to say that we can do that, but we can't do this on our own. We definitely need interim funding to get to that point in terms of the tackling the ongoing lingering effects of the pandemic via the top-up mechanism. And going forward, there's no question we will need substantial capital support to address another area of concurrence, which is that we know we need to invest in order to create jobs and to improve the system, to get people back onto it and to maintain it in state of good repair. We need to invest to transition London's transport system to a carbon neutral, environmentally friendly state, and that can be done. And we need to invest, linking from that point, to play our part as TfL and London in levelling up. We spend 55p of every pound around the country. Let's take our new Piccadilly line trains as an example. They're being built in Goole, in East Yorkshire. We buy steel in Scunthorpe. We buy buses in Ballymena, in Falkirk, and in Guildford. So there's quite a lot of areas of concurrence, but the main sticking point remains the need. Government insists that the City Hall, the Mayor, should find a larger contribution to the operating gap. City Hall are addressing that. We are looking at that. And I really do hope that we can now close that gap, those areas of difference, such that we can move off the short-term deals and move on to long-term deals and be able to plan with certainty. And to be frank, and answer your questions with more certainty, because a lot of the variables will have been taken out.
Thanks. And just to build on what Andy's saying, I think in terms of the financial sustainability plan, as I said earlier in the meeting, we set out 3 very different scenarios about trying to explain that the interconnected decisions about service levels, investment and outcomes are choices, and that we set out a very positive, delivering everything the government and the Mayor have said that they want in terms of our policy consistent approach. We then set out something that was recognised the financial reality with the financially constrained scenario, and then we set out something that we as transport professionals think would be a very bad outcome for the city in terms of the managed decline if agreement can't be reached around those funding scenarios. The biggest issue we've had is that the discussion has been dominated around the who pays the operating subsidy as the Commissioner has set out, and we haven't therefore really got into addressing what is it that is a shared priority between central government and London's government for the transport system in London. What sort of outcomes do we want to achieve, and how should they be appropriately funded? So now we are making progress on resolving the short-term issue. We hope that that will unlock this ability to have these longer-term discussions, because the thing that was missing was that we set out these scenarios hoping to have a proper dialogue and a discussion to understand what level of investment would be available, so that we could plan accordingly. We need to get there in the next few weeks and months so that we can actually put a long-term plan together, and that's really critical that we reach that soon.
I'm no expert, but it appears to be in pandemic management that February is a crucial time in that issue. February is also a crucial time when you go back to government around the short-term issues of funding. So what, in terms of timescales, are we still looking at? I understand from previous papers you've said there's a certain point when we have to go into managed decline. I could argue that we're in management decline already, to be honest, because whatever happens, there are going to be some tough decisions and impact on services for the long term, whatever we do, right, in terms of some of the finances. So can you just very quickly sketch out a sort of a timetable? Not that we're going to hold you to it. Timetables move. We know that. But
Yeah.
what would be, from a TfL perspective, in managing the services, put it on a stable footing long term, what is it that you professionally would be looking for in terms of these negotiations?
So you're absolutely right, Assembly Member Duval. There are two elements to the upcoming funding negotiation. There is the imminent and critical, how is TfL funded because of the COVID impact through the 22-23 financial year that's almost existential, to be honest. But then at the same time, we have to understand what capital funding will be available for the years beyond 22-23 because of the long lead time to either make decisions to reduce services and investment, or to continue with our planned increases or improvements to things. So let me give you an example. By the time we get to the TfL board approving the final budget for next year, well, hopefully the final budget for next year in March, we need to know what funding is going to be available so that but not just for 22-23, we need to know, looking forward to 24-25, a reasonable assumption upon which we can decide what is the size of the bus network we can afford to run. That's because there's a 12 to 18 month lead time to making changes through the contracting process to the shape of the network. What we currently face is through the lack of certainty beyond the short-term deals that we would have to not award contracts, and then we would have to make decisions about how we would reduce the size of the network to one we could afford financially. Similarly, on the tube network, we would have to look. The tube network is very different, and it's worth understanding the differences between the two. The bus network is contracted, and you can flex the size of the bus network because about 20% of the bus network comes up for retendering every year, and then there's a lag of 6 to 12 months before those new contracts take place. But on the tube network, you've got 272 stations, 450 kilometres of track, thousands of bridges and structures. You've got the system you've got, and unless you decide to reduce the system by closing stations or lines or significantly changing the frequency such that you don't buy the same number of trains in the future, it's really difficult to change the cost of running the tube network. And I think that's something that we've tried but have as yet not really got to a clear understanding with our colleagues in government about the desired long-term transport position and why you can't flex things in the short term, particularly on the tube and rail network. And then on the bus network, if we are aiming together to get to a decarbonised public transport network by 2030, cutting the bus network in the next 18 months by 18 to 20% won't help us get there. But that is the financial reality we face. So our ideal would be to get a funding deal that covers the revenue COVID support through to April 2023, and then time to work with government over the next few months on a proper discussion about our shared capital priorities and how capital investment is going to be funded, so that we can order trains and signalling and manage our assets in the most efficient way. Because the one thing we do know, and government's own business cases show this, is short-term funding is 20 to 30% more inefficient than planning ahead and doing things properly through efficient contracting mechanisms that we've set up but are unable to use because we don't have the certainty to place those orders.
Thank you for that. Let's move on and see if we can make some pace on some of the next ones. So let's turn to new income sources options, and in terms of the reports to government. What's been the response to government around new incomes options? Can we see a copy of the report that TfL sent, as well as the government response? I presume that should not interfere with any negotiations, but it might well do. If you could just explain why that's the case, if that's that you can't do it now, but maybe you could do it later. And then just in that timescale that you outlined to us, to my earlier question, where do these revenue raising options fit into a timetable? Because it seems to me, from the way you've described it, some need to, we're running out of time here, some need to happen now. It's no good later, because we lose either the efficiency savings that they're meant to save, because we'll be spending something out on something else. So if you could do that.
So I'll start, Andy, and then perhaps you want to jump in. So the independent panel report on income options, which is already in the public domain, is it's a very good source of thinking about what type of income options are we looking at and have presented to government. So effectively, that review helped us as TfL to think about what income sources we could submit to the government. Broadly speaking, if you're limited to the Mayor's existing powers, which is what the Secretary of State for Transport has said, the only options you have are fares, council tax, business rates, which, as you know, are already fully allocated, and the borrowing against the business rate supplement is already fully allocated to Crossrail, and then schemes for managing emissions and congestion on the roads, which cannot be designed to maximise income. So very, very limited set of levers. The independent review called for greater devolution to the Mayor to be able to use some of the £40 billion a year of net surplus that London generates for the rest of the country. Broadly speaking, we're asking for £1 billion of that 40 billion a year in order to ensure that we avoid the managed decline scenario and give the London transport and Londoners and the rest of the country the transport system that London needs. In terms of where are we right now, we are at a very critical point with government around thinking about what are the options beyond the council tax increases that the Mayor has discussed and put forward, and what he will determine in terms of fares very shortly to generate at least 500 million. So I think right now we need to get some feedback from government as to what they will support, having ruled out the Greater London boundary charge, having ruled out the devolution of vehicle excise duty, and having ruled out also looking at new taxes, such as ones which might allow us to relieve the congestion that deliveries of online sales are having on the transport network in London. They've all been ruled out. What we haven't been told is what the government will rule in, and that is the subject of the current negotiation. So once we've got through that, I think at that stage we could share more widely what those were.
I don't want you to stray into the world of politics here. That's for that. Politicians can do that. But in terms of ruling out issues and not actually identifying areas where you could have conversations and discussions, is that not akin to saying, actually, we want more cuts to our services here in London because that's the only way government is going to come in and support that? In terms of a professional view of running a service, and then the delays in telling you what, you know, when and you're going to get X and all these negotiations, is that leading to the consequences of cuts? Cuts in the service, a reduced service to Londoners from TfL?
Assembly Member, I'll take that if I may. I mean, as a transport professional, cuts are anathema to me. We should be obviously being mindful of prevailing demand, but we should be keeping London's transport system the jewel that it very recently once was. It would be madness, in my opinion, to cut back wholesale on this transport system, having, you know, Londoners have invested in it so much over the years, over the decades, because all that will happen if we do end up going down the road of cuts is they're quickly made and it takes a long time to redress them. And you end up with people jumping into their cars, you end up with gridlock, you end up with environmental deterioration. So there's no upside to that. So we should be trying to resist cuts, you know, tweaking the service, yet that makes sense if you've got a temporary issue like COVID. But we should avoid mass cuts or long-term cuts to both service and infrastructure maintenance at all costs. That has to be our starting point. So to that end, and I'm very proud of my team for doing this, we have written numerous documents for government. We wrote an income options report. We've done various capital reports. We've provided information for City Hall. We're leaving no stone unturned in trying to find a way to solve this problem without recourse to cuts. So I understand, and I agree with your point, that if you don't solve the problem, then you end up de facto having to go down a road of cuts, because that's your only option. Then if you don't have the income and you still got the expense, your only other option is to cut your costs and thereby cut service. We really don't want to go there. We're not there yet, but we are providing myriad options to government and to City Hall to try to close this gap, and we'll continue to do that.
And just to be clear, in terms of cuts, we're not afraid to switch resources to meet new needs or to fill gaps of new needs, because that may well be appropriate. Some people would argue that's as cuts. That's not a cut that I would not be opposed to. Meeting new needs on transport, delivering on transport, reorganising the way investment is done wouldn't be part of that cuts. But actually, we need to consider some of those issues, don't we, financially, for the sake of Londoners, to give a better service in some ways, or to continue maintaining a different type of service as technology moves forward. Is that, would you agree
that's
with
absolutely right. And you've seen us over the last few years reallocate services, for example, from central London, where there's a very high provision of public transport through the tube and rail network, as well as buses and walking and cycling provision, to outer London, where there's less provision of public transport services. What we're facing as a result of a lack of funding is a need. As the Commissioner has said, we have made reductions to services where they make sense to do so. We have not introduced timetable uplifts on the tube, even though the capacity is there, because we don't need that capacity. We'd already said that we would do a further 4% reduction of the bus network to reallocate, in particular, from central London to outer London. But what we now face is not a tweak or something that is designed to help improve the public transport network. We now face a financially driven need to cut our cloth in terms of what we can afford to that we can afford, depending on what level of funding we have, which, as you've seen around the country, tends to lead to significantly reduced public transport.
And if I might just add, just really quickly, Assembly Member, no, we're not tone deaf though. We do recognise temporarily, certainly, the prospect of undertaking such value-adding, compelling schemes such as the Bakerloo Line extension, Crossrail 2, they'll have to go on ice for now. The work's not wasted, it's archived, it can be resurrected, but for now we won't proceed with those projects, albeit there's a real clear case. So we're absolutely trying to do the right thing, but to protect the core service. What you won't do is solve this problem with just belt tightening and cut back on paper or whatever. We're talking a real big problem here that needs a substantial solution, and that's what we're trying to get government across.
Okay, now just very quickly on vehicle excise tax around that. Is that completely now off the agenda in terms of it's not going to be turned? Because that was really part of the devolution agenda that the Conservative government, might have been a previous Conservative government, but also that Boris Johnson championed when he was, I think, your boss here at the time when he was mayor. That's completely now off the agenda. They're not interested in that, don't accept it. They think it's a tax. Or no, they think it's a grant, don't they? That's it. They think it's a grant. We think it's about devolution and should come back into Londoners because it's raised of Londoners. So is that gone now? Is that not even...
Yeah, so as you'll recall, Assembly Member Duval, in the, I'm trying to remember whether it was the 2013 or 2015 spending review, when the block grant from DfT was removed and a smaller amount of business rates were devolved to the mayor, the discussion at the time was also over considering the devolution of vehicle excise duty and the devolution of suburban rail to Transport for London, both of which have been taken off the agenda. More than that, though, the vehicle excise duty, which is hypothecated to the maintenance of roads outside London, has pots of funding which TfL is not allowed to access. So even where there are pots for things like, Patrick might be able to think of the specific pots, but things that clearly in London we need, we're not allowed to access those, even though there is funding nationally for those things. It has been ruled out categorically that London could have devolution of its contribution to vehicle excise duty.
Okay, all right. Well, that's sad because I think that's somewhere where there could have been consensus about in terms of that particular sum of money and how it's used. Let's move on very quickly to the series of changes to fares and concessions as part of the income raising options to government and their potential impact on withdrawing the travel card agreement, both for TfL and for transport users. And just to sake of, just quickly, there's some follow-up questions here that I suspect that you could answer in terms of your response. You know, we talk about these issues in a cavalier way, I think, us politicians, and the potential impact of raising the Oyster card deposit from £5 to £7. TfL must have done some work on that. What does that mean for people that I think, going back to an earlier issue that the Commissioner was saying about people that use buses, the type of people that use buses and they're on low incomes. Can you also outline the proposed changes for over 60s concessions and the potential impact for TfL and transport users there? What's the government's position? Where's TfL's position on that? When I ask these questions, I'm not saying that I'm against change. I'm not saying I don't understand the financial situation that we now face ourselves in. But I am saying, do we really think through some of the implications of these changes and some of the choices that we've got? Can someone just deal with that quickly, because time is pressing for us.
Okay, so Assembly Member, I'll respect that and I'll keep my answer very brief. So you answer basically around three things: Oyster cards, the potential impact of raising the Oyster card deposit from £5 to £7 is an annual impact of £5 million positive, so that would raise some money. But I should have prefaced my comments by saying I take your point. None of these things are easy. There is a downside to all of these. They are what they are for a reason. But we're into the realm of tough choices. because of the situation in which we find ourselves. On the impact of withdrawing the travel card, we're evaluating that, but in terms of the adverse impact upon TfL, not many people, not as many people as used to be the case, use travel cards. They're still popular. They've been around for a long time, but most people use pay-as-you-go options, so the Oyster pay-as-you-go option, and that certainly offers more flexibility to customers. And so moving people onto pay-as-you-go and off magnetic stripe tickets does allow us to make some savings. With regard to the proposed change for over 60s concessions, that's something that we're looking at. The way that you would go about that is to progressively change the age of eligibility, currently starting at 60, to increase by a month every other month. So nobody would lose out on a concession they were already entitled to, but you would just raise the bar progressively. So to your question, in all cases there is detriment, but we are having to look at every possible option to close this financial gap, including those that are less palatable than we might have otherwise considered.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assemblymember Harani, did you still have a question, or has it been answered?
No, part of it's been answered, but part of it hasn't. So I'd like to come in if I can, Chair.
Okay, can I ask guests to keep it as brief as possible? We're running very, very late now. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. It's just on the 60 plus usage, because obviously the way it's funded is different to the Freedom Pass, and it's more reliant on TfL itself. So from a budgeting perspective, and in terms of the money that's been coming through over the pandemic, are fewer people actually applying for the 60 plus card compared to before the pandemic, or compared to what you'd expected?
We'll find that information for you as part of our return. The issue with the 60 plus card is because of the aging population, more and more people become eligible for it on an annual basis, and therefore the cost of providing it, which, as you say, is not like the Freedom Pass, it's not funded by the boroughs. It was introduced by the previous mayor. The cost of it goes up significantly every year with more and more people eligible for it.
And how, from a budgeting perspective, how do you work out the costs? Is it because once you've provided it, it's a flat fee, obviously, or flat impact on the budget once someone's applied, but then do you take into account what they would have spent if they were using it as a normal customer?
Yes, it is that revenue foregone that they would have paid had they been a user.
Okay. And a couple of years ago, I know a £10 admin charge was introduced by TfL to check addresses. So there's an annual £10 address check charge. What has been the budgetary impact of this?
I haven't got that to hand, so we'll provide that as part of the further follow-up.
Thank you, Chair. I'll hand back to you.
Thank you. I've seen your hand, Dr. Sahota. I'll bring you in at the end of this section because we must make progress. Assemblymember Russell.
Yes, my questions I think can have quite brief answers, so hopefully I can help with the time problems. So for Simon, at the Budget and Performance Committee meeting on the 5th of January, the Mayor said that the proposed changes to fares and council tax increase would... changes to fares and the council tax increase would not hit the 500 million income raising target. So how much are the measures expected to raise?
So I think, as was set out on the council tax specifically, the approach on council tax to raise it by £20 per annum over the next 3 years would eventually generate 172 million per annum at the end of that 3-year process, and then the changes to fares structure and ticketing, such as those elements we've just been discussing, would generate somewhere between 60 and 80 million. So we'd, broadly speaking, be left looking for about half of the 500 million would still need to be generated by finding another new source of funding.
Okay, and so what else is being considered to generate that 250
as we've
million?
discussed throughout the meeting, it's really looking at, given that the levers available to the mayor are fares, council tax and forms of charging, we are looking at options around what is next after the expansion of the ultra low emission zone.
Okay, so my next question is for Andy. Has the mayor asked you to explore the use of a more dynamic fare pricing system for fares, and what will this cover, and what would the financial impacts be?
Well, we are looking at options on dynamic fare pricing, noting that we already, to a certain extent, have that with the higher price in the peak as opposed to the off-peak. That said, it's not as easy as, I mean, people sometimes liken that to, say, surge pricing on Uber. It's actually more complex to do on a fixed system and on a mass transport system. So I think in the interest of time, my best answer would have to be, we do not have any firm proposals at this stage. We're working on them, but we do recognise that dynamic fare pricing may have a part to play in solving this problem. So at the moment, we don't have a solution, and therefore we can't quantify the financial impacts.
Okay, and so what's your timescale to know when to get a firm proposal, and do you have a sense of how quickly any changes could be implemented?
Typically, changes, I mean, for example, on dynamic fares and, or for that matter, other emissions-based charging schemes, they're slightly different topics, but they're typically not quick to implement because you've got to do consultation, you've got to implement, in some cases, the paraphernalia, the actual equipment, in order to make the system work. You've got to have systems in place. So they're typically not quick fixes, but because of our pressing financial problems, we are, as a matter of expediency, looking at all options.
Okay, so when you say they're not quick to implement, are you talking like a year, 2 years, 3 years? What sort of time? How long would it be for any of those kind of plans to be able to start affecting the budget?
It would be certainly minimum of a year, depending on which scheme we adopted, but more likely several years because of the factors that I just described. These things are not quick fixes. They are issues that need to be looked at very closely, and in some cases require physical equipment to be installed and of course paid for. And at the moment we don't have the money to pay for them, so we're in a bit of a quandary. It's a bit of a catch-22. You need to put money in to make changes to systems in order to achieve savings, or rather to generate greater income. But if you don't have the money in the first place, you're somewhat stymied.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you for your brevity there. Assembly Member Fortune.
Thank you, Chair, and I too am aware of time. My first question is for Enver, who's in the ether somewhere, and this is about the Mayor's consultation budget document. And I just want to zoom in on something at paragraph 6.22, which says that further to the requirements of the 1st of June 2021 funding arrangement, the budget assumes a widening of road user charging schemes in later years. Could you point out where it specifically talks about requirements for expanding the road user charging?
It's part of the letter that government have been sending in to the mayor. That is one of the permissible options for generating income, but as Simon said, it needs to be within the policy. So there isn't the detail behind that at this stage. It's still part of the options that are being worked up.
Thanks, Enver. I've got the letter in front of me. And that's why I was drilling in on the use of the word requirements. And, you know, it's not a matter of semantics. What I didn't want from that document was the impression that it was set out that increasing road user charging was somehow baked into any agreement. It's a choice. It's you know, there are limited options, I get that, but it's one that the mayor has. It was not a requirement specifically set out. So, Patrick, if I could turn to you. When we look at the assumptions based for increased income when it comes to road user charging in the 23, 24, 25 consultation budget, what are those? What specific schemes or what schemes are those assumptions based on?
So in terms of the income assumptions, we've assumed the continuation of all the schemes that we currently have in place. I think what you've observed again is the difference between the final Mayor's consultation budget and the original TfL submission. And as we've already described, in that final submission, we included the assumption that we generate the £500 million additional revenue that is a condition of our government funding deal. And we allocated the elements of that 500 million to the things that the Mayor has announced, the council tax changes and some of the fares changes that we've discussed. The balancing item of that 500 million, as a financial planning assumption, we did add into the road user charging line in the budget. So that is the increase that you observed in the final Mayor's consultation budget.
Okay, so for my clarity, it's the current schemes that are there, but there is that assumption on other road user charging schemes to make up that difference. So what would those schemes be?
There are no assumptions what those schemes would be. As I said, it's a financial planning assumption based on the balancing number to be found from the £500 million target.
Okay, so there's no specific scheme. That's great. So, Andy, and I apologise, I've been bugging you about this for ages. There was a feasibility study started last year. We first, I think, spoke about this in June, which looked at potential schemes like a boundary tax, which would hit, I think, all the constituency members who are here. And we were looking for that document to be released last year. The last time I'd spoke to the Mayor about this, he said, and apologies, I didn't mean to get you in under any pressure, but he said he'd give you a nudge and that it would be released later this month. So have you seen that paper yet? Has the Mayor seen that paper which looks at some of these potential schemes?
First up, there's no need to apologise. I'm here to serve you, and therefore my default is to be helpful. The report, I have seen the draft of the report. It is not yet in final state. I'm very aware of the fact that you've asked to see it, and my commitment stands that I will get it to you as soon as possible. It really shouldn't be much longer now. It is in an advanced state.
Thank you. So when will that paper be going to government, DFT, etc.?
Obviously, I've got to follow a chronology whereby I get City Hall's assent to send it across to government, and that's something that is on my to-do list.
So is there a deadline for that?
Well, I mean, the sooner we get to government, the information required in order to achieve a deal, the sooner we'll achieve that objective. So rest assured, I'm very focused on that. I don't want to be the architect of delay. I want to make sure that we give government, obviously with City Hall's consent, everything that they need in order to for us to what I already believe to be our compelling case to be agreed to, because we desperately need the money and the certainty of future funding.
Okay, but there's not a deadline of when that paper, those studies have to go across.
Is there a specific on that?
So we are. It's almost like being on mute on Teams. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
As part of the current discussions with the government, we will be sharing drafts of that paper in advance of it being published, and that is what we've agreed. So we'll be discussing it with them and sharing.
But is there a deadline of when that paper has to go across?
There's not a deadline for the publication of the paper as
Not the
yet.
publication.
Will be
Is there a deadline when it has to get delivered to government with these options for expanding road user charges, which would include boundary tax and things like that?
Well, sorry, I misunderstood your question. I could have answered it. So as Simon says, there's no deadline for publication. We are required, under the conditions of the current funding deal under which we find ourselves, to provide further information to government by the 14th, whenever that is. It's this today, isn't it? Is it?
Yeah.
Or imminently, I can't remember what date it is. And a draft, and then a final report by the 19th.
Okay, so there's a paper going to the government today with some of these options and the feasibility study.
If today's the 14th, which I see, yes, it is,
Okay.
you are correct. So,
Great. I'm going to have that clipped and sent to my wife. So on that paper, are there things like an expanded Ules zone that will cover all of London?
I don't think it would be right for me to comment on the content of the paper until the government have seen it. I'm very worried or concerned about prejudicing the discussions. And I'm sorry to be so cagey, it's not my natural disposition, but I just want to avoid government saying you should not have talked about this publicly.
I can completely agree with that, Andy. Actually, I brought this up with the Mayor's communication people, and I said we shouldn't have discussions about some of these things in public and in the press. Their response to me, which I'll use, is that there's a responsibility to keep the public informed. So I would perhaps bounce that back. And that was to the Mayor's comms team, not to you. So in terms of the expanded road user charging, where is the Mayor on this? Is he broadly in agreement with what's happening, or...?
I think that question is best posed to the Mayor. The Mayor the Mayor, his team, and TfL are having an active dialogue, as recently as yesterday, an active dialogue on all possible options to bridge the gap and to solve the problem that we've been set by government, namely to find the minimum of £500 million annual additional revenues. So that's a very active dialogue at the moment. I don't think I should answer for the Mayor on where his head is at, but it's a very active dialogue with him and his team.
Okay, thank you. Simon, if I can move to you, there was an independent review into TfL's finances that suggested about 100 million a year could be saved by reforming the pension scheme. Has any of this been included in the budget submission?
So the funding deals have required a review to be undertaken on TfL, an independent review to be undertaken on TfL's pension scheme. That review is being led by Sir Brendan Barber, and that review will report to the Commissioner on the 31st of March of this year. So we haven't included anything in the budget thus far, because it would be precipitous to do so before we know what the independent review is considering and recommending by way of changes or not to the pension scheme.
Okay, and that's still on track for March, is it? We're not looking at any slippage there.
Yeah, the review's still on track. So it's worth just explaining a little bit about the pension scheme itself at the moment, is that given the way in which the pension scheme has been set up, the primary cost to TfL of the pension scheme one of the major costs to it is driven by the fact that it has been set up in the past by central government as a trust and therefore captured as a private sector scheme rather than a public sector scheme, given we are a public sector sponsor. And as a result, we have to effectively address any deficits in the scheme over a much shorter period than any other public body, which drives significant costs and clearly is a strange position to be in with a public sector sponsor for the scheme. Also, TfL is not in a position where it can actually force or choose to make changes to the scheme, in that the rules of the scheme are such that we would have to consult with both the trustee and members, and a majority of the 85,000 members of the scheme would have to turn up in person and agree to any changes to the scheme. So as you can see, one of the discussions we've had with government is notwithstanding the fact that the review is the right way to look at the scheme and decide if there is anything that is worth discussing in terms of changes. If it was desired to make changes, it would require government support to make those changes, given the way in which any changes have to be approved.
Probably why the independent review suggested it was a bit outdated and has to be reformed. So I can see the challenges there. And it's still a final salary defined benefit scheme, isn't it?
It is a final salary defined benefit scheme, yes.
Wow. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Pigeon, did you still want to come in?
It's just very quickly, given that this budget and what we've just been talking through, you've exceeded your savings target of 300 million. This was a precondition for the 12 million in bonus payments to senior staff being made in the financial year. So will you still be making those bonus payments, given, as we've discussed this morning, the tricky financial position you're in?
Thank you, Assembly Member. They're performance awards. I know that they're known as bonuses. And let me just be crystal clear: they are not payable now. What the arrangement we made, which was in response to a mounting concern that I have about retention of talent at TfL, where we're seeing an absolute exodus of very capable senior people to run this organisation and to deliver the savings programmes that we need. And someone's got to do it, so you want quality people doing that. We proposed, or the Remuneration Committee rather, proposed a mechanism whereby performance awards would be reinstated for this current year and next year, but only payable if we reach a position of financial sustainability. So that would be by 23-24. So they're only payable if you are still with the company, if the overall scorecard objectives are met, and if we achieve that, which would be quite a remarkable turnaround actually, that target of financial self-sustainability. So we're not talking about this year. It's an accrual, and it may or may not come to pass. If we don't achieve financial self-sustainability, then there will be no performance awards made. Again, my motivation here is to try to stem an alarming exodus of talent, including my world-class CFO to my right, who's unfortunately already announced his resignation.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Do you have a quick question, Assembly Member Sahota?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, this is just a quick question to Simon. Simon, I'm obviously listening to this remotely, but earlier on you were speaking that the option of the outer London boundary charge is off the table now. Did I get it right?
So the Secretary of State for Transport has been very clear that he does not support the introduction of the Greater London boundary charge and does not support or will not consider the devolution of vehicle excise duty.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Garrett?
Thank you. Hello, I was going to say morning, it's afternoon, I'm afraid. Just a quick question about the council tax increase. So I think you mentioned earlier, Simon, there's an existential risk or existential threat. I think that's what you referred to about the sort of PFL's funding pressure in the coming year, 2022-3. And there's part of that is this £20 Band D council tax increase, which was about 172 million pounds per year. But the first year, which is the year which it seems to me has the most acute financial pressure, you're not going to get that money. You're going to get it in year 2 and year 3 over that 3 years. So the coming year and the 2 years after that. You won't get it in the coming year. It will be sort of, kept securely somewhere in City Hall, wherever that is, for this coming year. And then in years 2 and 3, you'll get it. Do you understand the logic of why in the year with the most acute financial pressure, you're not getting the money that Londoners are paying in tax?
So I think the Mayor and his team answered that very fully when you saw them last week, and the part of it is to do with the mechanism for funding TfL through the 22-23 financial year. So I have nothing further to add to what the Mayor and the Davids said last week on this.
I mean, the reason I'm asking is because perhaps I didn't quite fully understand the logic of the answer. It seemed to be that for some reason that I couldn't quite follow, it was necessary to hold that money back at the point that it's. So I was just curious whether you understood it better than I did, or whether
yeah, apologies. Let me. So what I think they were trying to explain is the ask of the Mayor by the government was to make commitments to bring funding in for the 23-24 financial year. So the year beginning the 1st of April 2023 is the year in which the Mayor has been required to introduce new income. The Mayor is therefore mindful of TfL's financial situation and is introducing the charge this year, so that by the time we get to the year in which we no longer get government revenue support, there will be an additional amount of income to help bridge that £500 million gap. I understand that is the logic.
Thank you. We're now moving on to operating costs, and I'm starting this questioning. The questions start with managed decline, but you've kindly talked a lot about that already. But can I ask you, how did you arrive at the modal split for the 18% bus service reductions and 9% tube service reductions by 24-25?
So I'll let Patrick come in a second to give you a slightly more precise answer. But as I have tried to outline through this meeting, if you look at the two mass public transport services as the tube and rail services and the bus services, the bus service together with roads runs at a deficit of over £1 billion per annum. Pre-pandemic, the tube was making a surplus that covered not only its operating costs but its maintenance costs and contributing to its capital renewal costs. The impact of the pandemic is the tube is now losing over £1 billion per annum, and the business rates that we used to fund the bus network pre-pandemic now have to be used to fund the tube network in the first instance because of that fixed cost nature we talked about. So unless we shut stations and close lines, you can't make a material reduction over and above the 9% that we've announced to the tube network. But on the bus network, you can financially make a much greater saving, but at the expense of a much greater reduction in the bus network. So that is the rationale as to the split.
Okay, thank you for that. What level of service reduction is planned for 22-23?
Well, we have been planning and working on the delivery of the 4% reduction in bus kilometres by 23-24 that we had announced in our financial sustainability plan. If we are going down the managed decline scenarios we've discussed, that would require a much greater reduction in bus kilometres by 18% over that time period. Given the funding uncertainty and the fact that we're still doing everything we can as a team working with the City Hall to avoid the managed decline scenario, the exact plans for next year are not necessarily clear. But we do know, based on the changes that we have worked up, a package of changes will need to be implemented next year that reduce bus kilometres by around 9 million. As we talked about before, any major structural changes to bus routes will be subject to consultation. But there are a number of frequency reductions that we will have to make to meet the financial savings required that will be introduced over the course of 22-23.
Okay, will you have more detail on that soon?
So let me just jump in. Clearly, Chair, it's very dependent upon what financial arrangements we come to with government in early February. Everything is absolutely dependent on that. And we will have to come, once we know the results of that, to a March budget position. So at that point in time, we'll be able to give you further information.
Okay, that's fair enough. Simon, how developed are your saving plans for the 122 million of new savings in 22-23?
So again, as you will recall, Chair, we've had the programme that predated the pandemic of delivering £730 million of savings. In each year, as we approach the March budget, the Commissioner and I have review meetings with all of the teams, and we seek to finalise the savings positions for that year. So we're currently going through those challenge and deliverability sessions with the teams. And again, by the time we get to the end of March with that budget, we'll have the finalised position that we believe is achievable and deliverable savings target for 22-23.
Okay, fair enough. Your objective analysis, which forms part of your 22-23 budget submission, shows other operations with an operating cost of 885 million in 2021-22, which then increases by 1.033 million, so 1,033 million is in 22-23 before falling into 590 million by 2024-25. What is that line, and why does it have this spend profile?
So in the first instance, having talked about the potential need for the 18% bus reductions and the 9% tube reductions, we've held them in the budget in that other income line. So the lion's share of the charges are the costs and then savings as a result of making changes to those service levels. We also have our group level contingencies against things such as asset failures and unknown unknowns, which also are held in those lines. And then the other operations also include the professional services, our estates functions, the London Transport Museum, our insurance subsidiary, and other businesses. But I don't know, unless Patrick wants to argue anything else, it's about the contingencies for next year. It's about how we think about the implementation and then the savings of those savings targets and those service reductions.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. I'll move now to Assembly Member Russell. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a question for Andy. I just wondered about the assumptions for the key safety metrics that are being delivered under this budget and plan. For example, are you concerned that the managed decline scenario may have an impact on the numbers of people who are killed and seriously injured on TfL roads?
Thank you, Assembly Member. Well, first up, I'll note that the scorecard for this forthcoming year has yet to be set, and obviously we can only do the scorecard once we know, and therefore the targets, once we know, and the outputs once we know what our budget is. But I think that you may be aware that my colleague, the Chief Safety, Health and Environmental Officer, Lily Matson of TfL, appeared before the committee, I think it was Tuesday, and she briefed the rather alarming statistic that if we do not get the level of budget that we need for Vision Zero purposes, there will be potentially an additional, as per the modelling, it's not absolute, it's not a prediction, but as per the modelling, a flatlining of casualties at 2019 levels, and that by 2030 we estimate Londoners will suffer an additional 117 fatalities and around 3,500 serious injuries. So for the reasons we talked about earlier, I really want to avoid that. I thought Lily covered that in detail, and I'd certainly, in the interest of time, advocate that or suggest you look at what she said.
Absolutely, thank you very much. What about the service volume metrics that will be delivered by the 2022-23 budget for the bus network, the London Underground and for the Elizabeth line?
So in a similar way, until we know what the funding brings for next year, we can't put the scorecard together, so we'll be aiming to set those out alongside the budget to the TfL board in March.
Okay, so once your funding is clear, then presumably you're kind of working towards the scorecard for the various different scenarios. Okay, and then finally, what level of state of good repair for carriageways is expected in each year across this budget and plan?
So unfortunately, the same answer applies in that we have a target level of state of good repair that we would want to be achieving were we to get sufficient funding to do so, which I'll let Patrick potentially answer in a moment. But until we know what the funding is available, we don't know what investment we can undertake, and therefore we don't know what state of good repair we can be targeting. So again, this is all part of the funding discussions we have with government.
I appreciate, and obviously the state of good repair of the carriageway also impacts on the safety outcomes. Sorry, Patrick, did you want to?
Well, I was just going to illustrate, so we do have a range of scenarios, and I think this is a good indicator to show the breadth of uncertainty that we're currently dealing with. So as Simon mentioned, we do have a target for state of good repair of carriageways to be between 90 and 95%. That's where it was in 2017 after a number of years of hard work to improve the asset condition. As we've had to reduce the level of proactive capital renewals on the highway network for the past few years, that's reduced and is currently 88%. Under a managed decline scenario, unfortunately that will continue to decline and could reach as low as 85% over the business plan period. Under our preferred investment scenario, it would go back to that target and it'd be back at 91% by the end of the business plan period. So we're faced with a wide range of potential futures, and until that funding is clearer, we can't work through which direction we want in any more detail.
Okay, thank you. That's incredibly worrying because the state of the carriageway feels like it's just one of those absolutely basic fundamental things about the TfL assets, like, you know, the rails for the tube and things. Yeah.
I share your concern, Assembly Member, because it goes to my earlier point of you make these cuts at leisure and you regret them. So you make them in haste and you regret them at leisure, okay? There's so many examples around the world of where infrastructure has been allowed to decline, and it takes a long time to claw it back, to get back to a state of good repair. And we really are trying everything possible to avoid that doomsday scenario.
Mm-hmm. I need to hand back to the chair, but just if you can keep in mind that sense of doing things like reducing speeds, because that can, you know, that could help to kind of, if you don't get as much money as you're hoping for things like road maintenance, it could actually extend the safe life of road surfaces while also having that beneficial impact on reducing road death and injury.
And of course, Assembly Member, outside London, that's exactly what VED is hypothecated to do. So again, it's, you know, it is very challenging not being able to access the same pots of money for the same types of activity as the other national public agencies.
Indeed. Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Garrett.
Hello, a couple of quick questions, hopefully. I think to Simon, it's a question about cash balances. So we see sort of in the figures that you give to us the year-end figure, and I just wondered whether what was the sort of low point of cash balances, because obviously it's a very movable figure. So since last April.
Yes. So prior to today, the notes tell me that the low point was a cash balance of 1.257 billion on the 29th of April 2021, which without the 3.2 billion pound of government grants that we had received would have basically meant we would have been nearly 2 billion pounds in deficit. So clearly not able to continue with our transport operations. We've set out in the budget document a slide on page 3 of the board slides where the dark blue line shows you what the cash balance would be without the government funding, and it shows that the profile of government funding is what is keeping our cash balances higher. As of this morning, the TfL cash balance is only just over 1.2 billion again. So that is the thing for people to understand about TfL's cash balances. We've got about 3.7 billion of current liabilities, so liabilities we have to meet in the financial year, and our only current asset with which to meet those liabilities is cash. So in a normal business, your current assets must meet or exceed your current liabilities. The existence of comfort and support from government and the access to funding in the past has meant that TfL doesn't need to hold 3.7 billion of cash, but the rating agencies have said we must hold at least a minimum of 1.2 billion of cash, which is less than 2 months' financial expenditure.
Sorry, and did you see? So it was 1.29 last April, but it's actually currently 1.2. So there was a low point last April, but the actual low point over the last year is today. Yeah. Okay. Presumably the next low point is tomorrow. Is that the forecast?
Yeah, it will carry on getting lower at the moment.
Okay. I'm not sure whether this might be one for Patrick. I'm just looking at the reserves figure, and between 22, 23 and 24, 25, you're forecasting that rises from about 650 to about 740 million. At the same time that we're in this sort of managed decline scenario and services being reduced and so on. So that seems like a counterintuitive change. I was just curious what the explanation was for that.
Well, if I just briefly explain the reserves and the relationship with cash, because these are the two primary measures we use to assess our balance sheet resilience. So as Simon said, our cash is our primary metric, and we have a policy of maintaining a minimum of 1.2 billion. And the other metric we use is our accounting reserves, the general fund reserves that you see in the GLA budget submission. And our policy there is to hold a minimum of 500 million in reserves. And the difference between those two figures is, as Simon has explained, an element of our cash in our bank at any one point has actually already been spent effectively. It's a timing difference that will fund the invoices that are either about to come in or have come in and waiting to be paid. So there's about a £700 million timing difference, which explains the difference between our accounting reserves and our cash reserves. However, the story on both is the same. At present, we are down to our absolute minimum on both those measures, approaching 1.2 billion of cash and approaching 500 million of general fund reserves. Those numbers have been calculated. Our 500 million reserves is approximately 5% of our total expenditure over the course of a year, and benchmarked against local authorities around the country. That's about in line with large local authorities around the country. And that minimum cash balance, again, is looking at other metros around the world that actually tend to hold more than 60 days cash, in the order of 90 days and sometimes more. So we see both those numbers as the absolute minimum. We need to assess the risks that we're facing at any one point in time to assess the appropriate level over and above that. And over this period of the GLA budget, crucially, the government have outlined after March 2023, they will not provide us any further extraordinary revenue support, nor maintain the revenue true-up mechanism that we've had throughout the pandemic that's protected us against revenue risks. So actually our risk exposure over this period is increasing. From 23-24, if we're to be financially sustainable, we need to be able to accommodate revenue shocks again. And we see in a post-pandemic world, the variability on revenue will be greater than it was pre-pandemic. Pre-pandemic, we planned between 2 or 3% volatility in revenue. We see going forward, that'll be significantly more. It could be 10 or 20% volatility, given people's increased flexibility to make demand choices. Prior to the pandemic, we saw our risk exposure increase with Brexit, and we built up our cash reserves to over 2 billion of cash and over 1 billion of accounting reserves, given the risks that we saw. And that was crucial for managing us through the early stages of the pandemic. As we come off that revenue support, again, we want to do a similar position of a very small increase in those reserves to about 1.4 billion of cash and 700 million of accounting reserves to protect us against that increased risk exposure. In an ideal world, there would be more, but we think this is the absolute minimum we need to protect us against the risks. And it's not just revenue risks, there are other risks, but that's one of the key ones that we're focused on, as you will understand, because of the pandemic.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Chair. Thanks.
Thank you. We're now moving on to capital programmes, and my colleague, Assembly Member Fortune, will start us.
Thank you very much, Chair. As the Chair says, this is moving on to capital programmes. So the question is, with the levels of business rate income having been maintained compared with the pre-pandemic 2019 TfL business plan and the government funding income shortfalls, what's the thinking and the driver behind the managed decline approach in the context of capital programmes?
Thank you, Assembly Member. So the starting point to understand is, whilst you're correct that the business rate element hasn't changed, in the 2019 business plan, our forecast for our total income for 22-2023 was £1.5 billion higher than it is in this GLA budget process. So the impact of COVID and other things is that we've effectively lost £1.5 billion of income to fund our operations and our services for the 2022-2023 financial year. Also, as therefore a result of that, in the summer, and some of the numbers that have been referred to by yourselves and by some of the government officials, our long-term capital plan and our financial sustainability plan set out the mixes of types of capital investment that would be needed. And under a managed decline capital investment scenario, whilst almost all net new capital expenditure stops, you have to do more replacement and renewal of your existing assets unless you want to cut services at a faster rate than the rate of decline that was built into those things. So in the long-term capital plan, you would have seen a significantly higher renewals capital investment number than the 2019 business plan, but you would have seen a significantly lower new capital enhancement number than the 2019 business plan. By the time we've got to the GLA budget submission, of course, where we are recognising that the money the money isn't going to be available, we've made significant reductions such that we have financially capped our renewals for 22-23 at 100 million below the 2019 level and significantly below the level we would otherwise need from an asset condition perspective for 2022-23. And we've also reduced partially as a result of slowing down and deferring capital expenditure, but about 300 million lower in terms of the enhancements as well. Patrick, do you recall the figure over the period of the GLA budget that capital will be lower?
Yes, I think it's important that when comparing back to our 2019 business plan, that includes 2019, 20, 2021, the past couple of years, where due to the pandemic, we've invested significantly less than we were planning in those years. And an element of that has been deferred into this period. So to have a like-for-like comparison with the 2019 business plan, you have to look at the same period starting from 1920. Over that period, our capital investment, our new capital investment in the GLA budget is 1.4 billion lower than the 2019 business plan. That just reflects the scale of reduction that we've had to make in our capital enhancements.
Okay, thanks. I think I follow that. But then we've also got capital receipts of over 900 million baked in over the next 4 years as well, haven't we? Are we confident of that?
That's a very good question, Assembly Member Fortune. That 900 million of capital receipts refer entirely to our property and housing programme. We have separated the property and housing programme from the core funding of TfL because, as you'll be aware, the timing of property receipts is very volatile, and therefore in 2019 and previous business plans, the timing of capital receipts and the funding of our housing and property programme were integrated with the public transport offering. We've now been working with government to secure agreement that we've separated, still wholly owned by TfL, but our property activities will be self-financing through selling the types of properties that we don't need for the future in order to fund our housing programme and our other property activities. And the government, crucially, are going to allow us to start to borrow to fund our housing programme, because unlike any other property developer, we are capitally constrained but have masses of land, whereas most property developers have access to capital but struggle to acquire land. So the big change, which will enable us to both meet the ambition for delivering on housing, but also to generate a growing return to TfL to reinvest in our public transport network, is the ability to use the property as a self-funding and able to borrow, so it's not capitally constrained anymore, and we will therefore be able to take forward at a faster pace our property ambitions.
Will you be able to open a housing account in the same way that a local authority would, which will, present you with opportunities for borrowing, etc.?
So effectively, we'll have a wholly owned subsidiary that government and we look at as needing to be a self-financing entity that will be able to borrow against the income streams that it generates in order to accelerate the rate of delivery on housing and other things. And then also, as a result of that, we won't have to dispose of all of the properties we otherwise would have had to dispose of in order to fund that housing activity. So we'll have a growing capital value and growing income stream back to TfL, which is the right way to use public land to help unlock further investment in transport infrastructure.
And will there be ring-fenced seed investment into it?
So over the course of the last 12 months, we have moved TfL's property assets into this vehicle. So the property owns the assets, and as seen here, through an investment strategy that's had a lot of external scrutiny with a panel of industry experts from chairman and chief executives of major property companies. So yes, rather than using cash, they'll be able to buy and sell properties and then also use that as well as borrowing for the proceeds of delivering on our property aims.
Okay, I think that's something I'll pick up somewhere else. Just a couple of very specific questions around CapEx, because I'm mindful of time. Elephant and Castle, I know there are still some challenges with that. What options do TfL have to find that funding? It's a split arrangement, isn't it, between the shopping centre and TfL?
So the developer has already produced a significant amount of funding together with other parties to enable the station box to be constructed as part of the development at Elephant and Castle. The issue we have is that without confirmation of funding going forward, TfL's ability to fit out that station box to make it into a new station entrance is practically non-existent unless we can get the level of funding we require to do everything that we need to do. The Elephant and Castle is very important for development, but it's given the discussions we've been having on Vision Zero and step-free access, it's one of a number of things that we would have to think about the prioritisation of.
And finally, do we have any numbers from the Piccadilly line signalling project or the Bakerloo line? Some of the reductions in there. How many savings have been made?
Yeah, so the big issue with the Piccadilly line signalling first, and then those other major projects that we've basically put on ice for now, is we will save about £75 million in this next few year period by delaying the Piccadilly line signalling upgrade. But actually the issue is it's a £1.9 billion project, and we can't commit to a £1.9 billion project not knowing how it's going to be funded. So it's the entirety of the project and the ability to commit to it that is the greater issue than the amount of savings that can be generated by deferring it. And of course, in deferring major projects, all that happens in reality is they end up costing more money because the effects of inflation mean that the project will end up costing 2 to 3% more than it would have done on a compounded basis for however many years you defer it.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Thank you, Chair. Just picking up on these projects that you've put on ice, if you were to get further funding from government, perhaps not as much as you want to be able to do all of these schemes, but somehow, how will you then prioritise which scheme comes back on board? In particular, I'm concerned about accessibility, and we heard last week from the Mayor that basically beyond what you've got in build at the moment, there is nothing coming up to improve the accessibility of the network. So how would you prioritise those as well?
So at the moment, the prioritisation framework is one that's agreed with DfT, and as we go through the process of agreeing what funding is available, we will have to agree with them the ranking and prioritisation of different types of investment. It won't be solely for TfL to decide.
So, yeah.
I think the Commissioner and I have been clear that we see both the safety of Vision Zero and the access, the accessibility of our network as an extraordinarily high priority that we would wish to prioritise if the funding were available.
I add, Assembly Member, as are things that we just talked about, the Piccadilly line. You can't keep 1973 tube stock going forever. The Bakerloo line is 1 year behind, 1 year ahead, 1972. It's its 50th anniversary this year. You can't keep that going forever. And it's increasingly inefficient to do that. So these are all factors that we would include in that prioritisation exercise, because obviously one of the factors you should look at is investment to avoid cost is clearly a factor.
Yeah, absolutely. And 1972 is a vintage year, I have to say. It's a very good year indeed. Let's just go back to talking about housing, and you've talked about this new model, this subsidiary and so on, which is very interesting and exciting. It might be useful actually for some of us who aren't on Housing Committee to get a briefing on that offline so we fully understand it. But how are you managing that constant challenge of maximising your income against delivery of affordable homes? And are you able to provide us with a breakdown of the affordable homes, how many are likely to be family sized and and your timescale for delivering. I think it's 20,000 homes.
So we've fully adopted the London plan, and therefore across our property plans, we accept that we'll deliver on average the 50% affordable as part of that plan. The part of the sort of maturity of our thinking is that we have what we call a twin bottom line. So achieving the level of housing that is needed at 50% affordable rates and generating a level of income that allows us to generate the types of returns that would, for example, underpin the signalling upgrade on the Piccadilly line are equal weight objectives, actually. And it is, as the Lord Kerslake review into housing across the GLA group is ongoing, you know, we are all aligning on the fact that value for money includes wider considerations such as the delivery of 50% affordable housing, not just the pursuit of maximum return. So we're comfortable that the business plan we are agreeing with Treasury and that will fund with borrowing will deliver 20,000 homes, of which 50% will be affordable, and it will also deliver that growing capital value and income stream in the right sort of proportion, so you have a sustainable business.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Assemblymember Russell, did you still have something to come in on this? Very briefly, if you would. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, this is just to pick up on the capital programme and healthy streets. So Andy, looking at the numbers based on the draft budget and previous years, 2 years ago in 2020, we were looking to have had 405 million this year, the year that we're in. But with the pandemic, I think at best it was about 100 million, which was spent on healthy streets through street space, which was a quarter of what was expected. Now, looking at the capital figure of 39 million for 22-23, that is just a tenth of what was projected just 2 years ago in 2020, where we were looking at 414 million on healthy streets in the 2022-23 year. So that's a tenth of what was expected just 2 years ago. So these are massive, massive drops in healthy streets investment. And, you know, comparing that 39 million with the 41 million that is being spent on Silvertown in direct costs on top of the contract costs, I'm just wondering if you think that Londoners understand the implications of a managed decline scenario on the Mayor's ability to deliver on his policy priority to get more people walking and cycling and keep them safe while they're doing it.
Well, it's hard to speak for Londoners. We've certainly tried to, in recent weeks, explain what the implications of managed decline are without trying to be alarmist. I mean, we've been accused of being alarmist. I don't do alarmism. I stick to facts. We're hoping to avoid this scenario. But we have set out, because I think it's only responsible to do that, to set out in granular detail what a managed decline scenario looks like. And of course, managed streets are not immune to that. They have to play their part. We want to push on with our Healthy Streets programme. We want to push on with our Active Travel programme. It's part of the Mayor's transport strategy, as Simon said earlier, to get 80% of people onto walking, public transport or cycling within only a few short years. But this is, as I said earlier, all about choices. And so the Healthy Streets budget has taken cuts, same as everything else. We will continue to try to keep Londoners informed in an informed debate, which I hope resonates with government, so that we can come up with an affordable, fair to the taxpayer, but an affordable long-term budget for TfL.
Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. This is our last section, gentlemen, and it's budget risk. And Assembly Member Garrett, you have 10 minutes.
Okay. I'm not sure we'll need that time, because I think we've probably touched on some of the budget risk issues before. If I may just self-indulgently say before we start on that, I big fan of the risk charts that you produce. I think it makes it really easy to understand both the risk and the opportunity, where that lies and the size of it. And I have a note here from our officers to say that they quite like them as well. People after my own heart, clearly. The question was, which again, if you feel you've covered a lot of this already, let's not sort of dwell on stuff we've covered already. But it shows, compared with last December, a significant increase in risk to capital expenditure and operational expenditure. And I just wondered what was driving that.
So I'll kick off and then I'll let my colleague Patrick come in. Clearly, the level of inflation is having an impact on everybody, and we are not immune from it in TfL. So almost everything we do is delivered by way of long-term contracts, and both materials inflation, energy inflation, and other main price inflation feeds its way through into almost every aspect of our budget. As you'll know, an RPI is running at above 6% at the moment, and we work with the Crown Procurement Agency, Crown Commercial Services, to aggregate the buying of energy. As you all know, we're the largest user of electricity in London to power the tube and rail networks, and increasingly as the bus garages electrify to do that. So this year we had managed to secure all of our supply through Crown Commercial Services before the impact of inflation. Next year and the years thereafter, the expected elevated prices for electricity are a significant impact on what we do. Also, we still have those risks around, as we've said, we have to give a point estimate in these budgets for what demand and revenue might be. Clearly, we all know the reality is there'll be a range of outcomes, and also, given the ongoing uncertainty over COVID and then the return to work, the range of uncertainty around our income projections has widened. And then there is also that uncertainty over when we'll be able to make commitments to capital projects, and as a result of which the costs of those that had been negotiated but not signed up to are at risk of increase as a result of those inflationary pressures. Patrick, was there anything else you wanted to add?
Well, it is fair to say that our risk environment is increasing, but also under a managed decline scenario, there is more inherent risk in our organisation, such that, as well as the risk that Simon outlined, kind of from an exogenous perspective, with deteriorating asset condition, we're going to do everything we can to minimise that. That is the essence of the managed decline scenario. But there are risks that interventions will be required to do so, and we've had to include that in that risk analysis. So I think you're absolutely correct to note and be transparent about the range of possible futures that we're observing now are greater than 12 months ago, and specifically to the downside on that risk analysis. Thanks.
And on, I'm not sure whether this is you, Patrick or Simon, about the operational expenditure opportunity and what that is and what's increased from last year.
Well, certainly in our periodic results for a period of time, certainly for the last 18 months, you see that we're continuing to deliver small savings across the organisation. I say small savings, incremental savings that add up to quite significant amounts, millions of pounds. And that's through an incredible organisational effort to squeeze every penny of savings out that we can make. So when it comes to budgeting, it's quite hard to identify those proactively up front and say that's where these are going to come from. But we've observed a run rate of delivery so far, and we're saying if we can continue that effort, although it clearly gets harder each year, there's an opportunity for that savings to continue in future years, and that's what that opportunity reflects.
Thanks. And I think probably my final question on this, the income opportunity, is there anything, we've talked a lot about what that might be, is there anything in there that isn't the stuff we've already spoken about, such as charging schemes and different fare schemes and so on? I think only because we've gone over that quite extensively and we're running short of time.
The other element that's in there is the upside of potential faster returns to the office and faster returns to public transport should we have a different outcome than the one we're currently projecting as our base case. So that's probably the largest income opportunity there. Every 1% is about £50 million. So if we were to have a 10% faster return than our current projections, and that would clearly have a very significant upside opportunity for us on income.
That makes sense, thanks. And actually, sorry, I did say that was my final question. I have a final question. I don't know whether you've spoken to other parts of the GLA about the skill set, the expertise in producing, maybe it's the management of risk that sits behind this, or it's just the skill of producing these charts, about sharing with sort of colleagues in other bits of the GLA, because they're really good, and I think it would be helpful if we saw similar things from other parts of the GLA. I don't know who perhaps before you leave, that could be your final mission, would be to spread that expertise.
I'll speak to Enver and David and see if there's anything. I'm sure they're more than capable of producing these for you.
We'll share that great practice, Assembly Member, across the group.
Sorry, Enver, this is the downside of being virtual. I do apologise. Yes, but thank you very much. I'm sure we'll all look forward to it. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, and I echo that, Enver. I think it's something that should be copied, and I think we have said this before. Excellent, thank you. And that brings us neatly to the end of the meeting. Gentlemen, it's been so interesting. I certainly have got quite a few other questions I haven't asked. If any of my colleagues have, can you send them to Mr. Brand, please? May we send you a list of the questions that we haven't had time for, and you've very kindly volunteered us some information that you haven't been able to answer today. So, Andy.
May I just make one comment? Well, first up, I do pride myself on knowing facts. So it's around 3,000 train operators, in answer to your earlier question. And I would just like to say to the Assembly members, it's not our place to be evasive. I hope you haven't found us that.
No.
It's only because we're here to answer your questions. It's only because there are so many uncertainties right now that we've been not able to be as forthcoming as we normally would be. But we'll gladly provide you with the further answers, Chair, once we receive your list.
Thank you. And I may say I have never found you evasive, and I will say, as other colleagues have done, whenever I've asked you for something or emailed you, I have had a response immediately, and I thank you for that, and I'm sure colleagues feel the same. So I'd like to thank all of you for attending this morning and for answering our questions. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Thank you. Can we also delegate authority to me as chairman, in consultation with deputy chair and party group lead members, to agree any output arising from the meeting? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note its work programme for 21-22? Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 25th of March 2022 at 10 a.m. in the Chamber, City Hall. I've not been told of any other business, so I declare the meeting closed. Thank you.